Hey guys, tonight we begin with the scandalously legendary life of Cleopatra, the Egyptian queen whose intellect was as sharp as her eyeliner and whose political maneuvers were only slightly less famous than her rumored bedroom exploits. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Alexandria wakes like a drugged lion, slow, gleaming, dangerous. Masts crowd the eastern harbour, grain hulks listing under their yellow bellies. The lighthouse throws its last pale blink before day swallows it. In the palace quarter, marble is the first lie, smooth, imported, and pretending everything in Egypt is orderly. It isn't. The Ptolemies have turned family into a chessboard with 12 pieces, named the same, and the rules are simple. Marry your sibling, outmaneuver your uncle, pray the priests don't turn on you, and try not to die before dessert. Cleopatra is born into this, into a dynasty that treats brother-sister marriage like a fiscal policy, into a court so theatrical that the stage directions are carved in Greek, and the gods get billing. Her father, Ptolemy XII, all eats. The flute player keeps time with music, because it is easier than keeping time with Rome. He survives by bribing senators until the treasury aches, then squeezes the temples and the peasantry in turn, and the people, Egyptian and Greek and Jewish, and every mixture between, count out their rage like copper coins. When Auletes dies, he leaves a will and a problem. The will says Cleopatra and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, will rule together. The problem says Cleopatra is too clever to be ornamental, and the men who manage boys dislike clever women as a category. Regents move in like shadows. Pothinus, the eunuch treasurer with ink on his fingers and ice in his mouth. Achilles, commander of the palace troops, who believes iron is an argument. Theodotus, a Greek tutor whose lessons smell of knife oil. They whisper to the child king and blot Cleopatra out of documents like a smudge. Alexandria, which has always had more factions than streets, feels the tilt. Dock workers who load the state grain whisper about shortages. The museum scholars count, for the first time, the number of guards posted in their colonnades. The priesthood takes the temperature of the gods with careful hands, a degree up, a degree down, because the clergy of Pa and I.sis can make kings shiver if they decide the divine breath has cooled. Cleopatra refuses ornamental. She does the old Ptolemaic thing, she marries her brother, because the dynasty insists on genealogies that fold back on themselves like snakes. And then she does the un-Ptolemaic thing. She tries to rule. She signs decrees in her own right. She appears before militias and court officials, without the child king at her side. She pays soldiers from her own coffers, and makes a point of being seen at temples, speaking not through interpreters, but directly to priests. In a city that measures authority by sound, her voice is the first rebel music. The regents answer the new tune with a very old rhythm. Exile. Cleopatra is shouldered out of the palace, then out of the city, then out of the delta's wet light into dry country, where the wind files your bones down to an edge. She does not stay gone. In the eastern marches, she gathers mercenaries like stitches, thin lines that will hold if pulled at the exact right moment. Meanwhile, Alexandria turns feral under its marble. The Gabiniani Roman veterans left behind years before, now half Egyptian in habits and wholly Roman in swagger, sell loyalty by the week. Street militias patrol the canopic way in mismatched armor. The shrines are busy, the courts are busier. Kings and queens here are not throned. They are negotiated. Into this walks Julius Caesar, late and necessary. He arrives in pursuit of Pompey and a civil war that has unseamed the Roman world. But he steps onto an Egyptian board, where the pieces have been moving long before his ship kissed the quay. Caesar's calculus is blunt. Rome bleeds grain into its populace every month. Egypt is grain. The fleets loading in Alexandria's harbours are not food. They are leverage over a city that eats a million mouths. If he secures the Nile's harvest, he secures the Roman plebs' love, or at least their silence. Ships, grain, debt payments. All eats owed Rome, and Rome remembers like a bookkeeper. These are Caesar's simple sums. There is also the problem of prestige. The man who settles Egypt's succession writes himself as editor of the Mediterranean. Cleopatra knows all of this. Because Cleopatra notices everything, getting back into Alexandria is the first test. The palace is ringed with men who would recognize her face. The streets are ears. She trusts a Sicilian courtier named Apollodorus, and together they invent an entrance that isn't just an entrance. It's an argument one that says, "I will be where I choose." The bundle is carried in at dusk, a roll of rugs or bedding sent as a gift to the Roman general lodged in the royal precinct. The servants bow and pass. A knife, a tug, fabric collapsing like surf. Cleopatra spills into the room alive with lamp smoke and calculation. She rises not as a surprise so much as a statement. I am queen enough to make the impossible look like theatre. Caesar is many things: tired, brilliant, ruthless, vain. But above all, he is a reader of moments. The woman who steps out of the mat is not a petitioner. She is a partner auditioning. The pitch is not sentimental. She offers the Roman triad of power, supply, stability, spectacle. If he backs her, she can deliver Egypt intact, its priesthood, treated with the old courtesies she knows how to stage, its granaries unsealed on schedule, its harbours quiet under the lighthouse's eye. She can do the Ptolemaic thing, blur, mortal and divine, until resistance softens. She can do the Roman thing, pay what is owed, smile while doing it, make even tribute look like triumph. Also, this city is on the brink of fire, and she knows where the kindling is stacked. For a few days it is all whispers and footfall, then the room goes hot. The regents see what is happening and push the child king forward like a shield. The palace fills with armed men, the courtyards with rumours. The Gabiniani calculate whether their arrears are safer under a girl with a plan or a boy with regents who are theirs to bully. Priests burn extra incense and make a public show of neutrality, which in Alexandria means choosing the winning side slowly. Caesar announces that he will arbitrate the royal will. The regents announce that Rome has no right to breathe this far down the Nile. The city takes sides the way a body takes fever everywhere at once. If you press your ear to the marble, you can hear it. The economy beneath the politics. Docks that must load every dusk, or the Alexandrian poor will riot by dawn. Warehouses whose shutters are the difference between order and wolves. Moneylenders, reading the colour of the harbour water and setting interest rates accordingly. Caesar has it, too. He isn't only seduced by a queen. He is seduced by a system he can command, if he crowns the right head. Grain has always ruled Rome. Grain that arrives under a grateful queen's seal would rule it better. So the alliance is struck, in words and in gestures that the city understands. Cleopatra makes herself visible in the old royal ways processions in which costume is policy. The goddess soft copper of I.sis on her skin, the shapes of divinity worn like legal argument. Caesar makes himself visible in his ways edicts, banners, the crisp Latin of authority. It is not love that steadies the city first. It is logistics. The granaries open on time, soldiers are paid, markets are not. The priesthood is reassured that the sacred calendar will not be rewritten by foreign hands. To the factions who wanted a girl shunted aside and a boy on a gilded leash, this looks like robbery. To Rome, it looks like order. War follows, because this city speaks war fluently. You cannot seat a queen without unseating a regent who owns swords. But for a moment, an expensive, precarious moment. Alexandria is a theatre where two professionals share a stage. Cleopatra brings the city's stories with her, the double crown, the divine marriage, the perfume of legitimacy that clings to old rites. Caesar brings the Roman machine, the letters home, the financial conduits, the ships whose arrival is a vote count. Standing together, they are mathematics and myth, the Nile's bread and Rome's appetite, the harbour's masts and the forum's mood. spectacle braided with policy, until a city that devours rulers decides, briefly, to let this pair rule. Later, the songs will pick out the rug and leave the ledger out. That's how songs behave. But in the first hour, in that lamplit room with fabric at her feet, and a foreign general measuring what she might be worth, Cleopatra saves herself not with a trick, but with an argument only a city like hers could make. Back me, and Egypt will hum. Back me, and your Rome will eat. Back me, and we will turn a palace mutiny into a coronation. The harbour understands. She does not need to promise loyalty. She promises competence grain tallied, priests placated, soldiers fed, streets quieted, and in a world built on hunger, that is the sincerest seduction of all. Power in Alexandria had a sound to it, the scrape of styluses in the record offices, the murmur of petitions in shaded courts, the rhythmic chant of priests keeping the calendar in step with the river. Cleopatra learned to speak in all those registers. Plutarch will later say she could turn her mouth to many languages and needed no interpreter. What he misses is how that felt inside the city she ruled. For 3 centuries, the Ptolemies had treated Egypt like an expensive rental. Greek at court, translators in between, and a local tongue left at the temple door. Cleopatra walked through the door. She didn't just memorize phrases for ceremony. She learned the texture of Egyptian, the cadence of prayers to I.sis, the clipped demotic of tax ledgers, the hieratic turns that softened commands into blessings. And with that, she tuned herself to the machinery that actually ran the country. Interpreters are useful until they aren't. They add time, and time is where bribes grow. They add distance, and distance is where lies live. In a city that ran on receipts and omens, a queen who could hear a priest's hesitation, without a second man standing between them, had an advantage that no legion could give. In Memphis, the Wab priests who kept purity laws and watched the sacred lake found that when Cleopatra visited, she asked the right questions in the right words. In Thebes, the prophets, the HMN, the servants of the god, who issued oracles on festival days, discovered she knew the sequence of offering rites well enough to correct a lazy supervisor without humiliation. The clerks in the temple estates-men who measured grain on temple lands, who calculated rents, who recorded the movement of cattle and oil, watched her read a petition in demotic without pausing, and felt the floor tilt toward her. Language turned ceremony into policy. When Cleopatra took I.sis as her mirror, it wasn't costume, it was interface. She put the horns and disc crown on for processions, not simply to impress sailors lining the canopic way, but to signal to the priestly bureaucracy that their goddess and their queen were in one body for the afternoon. Coins spoke the same grammar. On Greek silver, she wore the diadem and a profile sharpened to authority. In Egyptian reliefs, she appears as the consort of Osiris, the mother of Horus, the living I.sis iconography that made tax remissions look like divine favor rather than fiscal maneuver. The city loved theater. The temples loved continuity. She gave both what they wanted and paid for it with comprehension. Consider a morning in the House of Life, one of those temple scriptoria where the air smells of papyrus glue and gum arabic, and the scribe's hands are stained a permanent brown. Priests bring her a thorny problem. A procession of I.sis is due to sail at the new moon, but the harbour guilds claim the barge cannot be released until key fees from last year's flood repairs are forgiven. In the old days, a Ptolemy would nod to a Greek minister, who would summon a translator, who would summon a harbour scribe, and a week later, an edict would blunder out, dignified and slightly wrong. Cleopatra listens, asks about the festival's precise station in the sacred calendar, notices that the guildsman's demotic slips when he quotes the amount owed. She answers in his dialect, and then in priestly Egyptian, folds Roman arithmetic into temple obligation, and produces a compromise. The barge sails. The guild receives a remission tied to an upcoming vow offering. The keymaster gets a public blessing and a private warning. She leaves with the priests, whispering that the goddess has good ears this year. The street heard it. 2. Processions through Alexandria were diplomacy with drums. When Cleopatra took the bark of I.sis along the canopic way, the column moved like a legal document you could dance to. Incense preceding policy, singers repeating names that doubled as titles, a queen on foot or on dais, depending on which message the city needed. Her Greek courtiers would have preferred consistent marble. She preferred mixed media. She let the perfume run ahead of her like rumor. She let the coins follow after like signatures. Between them, 1,000 eyes learned to map the same woman onto two worlds. She used language as a soft weapon in diplomacy. At audiences with Arab merchants, she negotiated in their tongue and asked about caravan water rights as if she had ridden those routes. With Judean envoys, she cited the right psalms and inquired about harvests in words that remembered rain more than rhetoric. With emissaries from Cyrene, she shifted to Greek, so supple that the philosophers listening blinked. Even Romans, proud of their Latin, embarrassed by their Greek, found themselves disarmed when she answered in their mother speech to a queen from the world's hinge, speaking not like a supplicant, but like a colleague. You could flatter a Roman with gold, you could own him with grammar. Meanwhile, the temples ran on bureaucracy, as much as on belief, and Cleopatra learned their balance sheets like a second liturgy. The priesthood wasn't a chorus of mystics. It was a civil service with incense. They controlled land, workshops, fisheries, and storage. They hired and fired. They maintained canals and calendared feasts to anchor the year. Winning them meant knowing how their offices smelled. She met with the stolists who dressed the divine statues and knew which rituals could be shortened without offense. She met with the archivists who held centuries of decrees and knew which precedents to cite when a remission or levy needed a religious spine. Fluency didn't just grease conversation, it gave her audit rights. When a temple steward claimed a poor harvest to avoid forwarding grain, she asked for the scribal tallies and read them herself. A queen who can pass columns of demotic numbers is a queen who can make a grain ship leave on time. The city's noise bent around this competence. Market women along the Heptastadion learned to call her not just Basilissa, but the good goddess. Sailors who had mocked earlier Ptolemies for their comic Greek muttered that this one had the Nile's smell on her. When she addressed a crowd, she didn't send a crier. She stood in the sun and spoke first to the priests in Egyptian, then to the merchants in Greek, then to the Roman garrison in Latin, and each group heard itself placed inside the state. There is a kind of sovereignty that comes from soldiers. There is another that comes from syntax. She used both. None of this erased the calculations in Part 1 grain. Ships, Caesar, debt. It underwrote them. Caesar could command legions and draft edicts. Cleopatra could conduct Egypt. To a Roman who thought temples were scenery, the administrative sprawl behind those columns was invisible. To her, it was the engine. Fluency unlocked it. Doors opened. Signatures arrived already sanctified. A procession's route doubled as policy rollout. When she left the House of Life that morning, a scribe slipped her a petty petition from a widow, complaining of a corrupt overseer. A queen who reads her own language doesn't have to trust a minister to summarize mercy. She wrote a note in a neat, demotic hand, and somewhere in a village, the overseer had a very bad week. Somewhere in the palace, a queen had reinforced the truth that mattered most in Egypt. The goddess hears you. Coins keep traveling after processions end. Hours after her bar had passed, a bronzed obol pressed into a dockhand's palm carried her profile nose strong. Chin, intent, gilding, definici. In temples along the Nile, the reliefs carved to please priests showed the same woman proportioned into divinity, offering mart to the gods. The tiny figurine of order, placed on a platter by hands that knew how to hold a ledger, between coin and carving lay the street, and she walked it in languages that fit. That was not charm, it was infrastructure, and it made a ruler out of a legend, and a legend out of a ruler. Power arrived in Alexandria, wearing dust and a frown. Julius Caesar had chased Pompey to Egypt in a civil war sprint and found, at the palace gate, a severed head, presented as a compliment by frightened courtiers. The gift revolted him and told him everything. This was a city where ministers thought ahead and misread the room, where the throne was a chessboard with knives, and where grain vast, river-born, city-feeding grain-made and unmade men in Rome. Caesar didn't come to add another corpse to the mosaic. He came to close accounts, secure supply, and crown a narrative. Cleopatra made herself part of all three. The palace war began with paper and unpaid debt. Her father had signed to buy his way back onto the throne. Money advanced by Roman power brokers, who now wore Caesar's seal. Cleopatra's brother husband, Ptolemy XIII, ruled by tutors with hard mouths Achilles. Pothinus, the rhetorician Theodotus, answered not with ledgers but soldiers. Caesar announced arbitration. The court answered with a siege. Alexandria, coastal and cunning, turned its harbour into a weapon. Fires leapt from ship to ship. The Pharos lighthouse became a contest of stairwells and arrows. Salt water ran where fountains should have been after Ganymedes. A Clewa, enemy, commander, fouled Caesar's cisterns with the sea. The city fed on rumour and smoke. Inside the royal quarter, the queen, who had arrived in a rug, unrolled herself into state, fluent, unshaking, and now indispensable to a Roman, who suddenly needed local traction. Understand Caesar's math. Rome's belly was a political fact. The urban dole grain distributions to the poor could turn a crowd into a cudgel or a coalition. Years of civil war had frayed supply from Sicily and Africa. Storms and pirates made convoys roll dice. Egypt's harvest, predictable as the Nile's flood, when properly managed, could steady the capital's pulse. And, by extension, Caesar's. A friendly Alexandria meant full warehouses at Ostia, quiet streets on the Aventine, and senators forced to argue on his terms, instead of behind barricades of hungry men. A hostile Alexandria meant winter riots and bad omens. Cleopatra didn't have to charm him. She had to make the shipment schedule look like destiny, and herself like the only person who could keep it. So she fought the palace war. As logistics wrapped in myth, her allies rallied Greek mercenaries with pay she promised and could meet. Her priests kept festivals on time so the city's rhythm didn't slip into panic. Harbour guilds, soot in their beards, took her side because she could speak their fees and speak for their god. Outside the palace, Caesar gambled for time, holding scraps of key, sending for help along sand-coloured roads. Mithridates of Pergamum hustled south with a relief force like a stitched rumour. Jewish auxiliaries under Antipater marched as if a new book of the Maccabees were being written with Roman ink. On a winter day by the Nile, battles snapped shut. Ptolemy XIII's camp broke. He fled in a crush toward the river. A gilded cloak dragged him down in water, the colour of history. When the current smoothed its hands, Cleopatra's brother king was a memory, and her throne was a fact. Then came the pageant, because victory needs a theatre. Caesar, who understood the appetite of eyes, rode the Nile with Cleopatra, as if the river were a scroll he intended to read aloud to Rome. Barges lacquered, with sun drifted past palm and column. Singers braided Greek harmonies around Egyptian drum. The queen appeared sometimes as sovereign, sometimes as goddess, always as answer. To Alexandrians, the cruise meant the gods were satisfied, and the state was solvent. To Caesar's men, it meant their general had turned a siege into a staged alliance. To Caesar himself, it was an insurance policy, a spectacle you could spend later. He did, in Rome, when he dedicated his new temple of Venus Genetrix, the divine ancestress he claimed for his line. He set within it a statue that told a story the Senate did not want to hear. A foreign queen's likeness, gilded and elevated in a sanctuary, tied to Caesar's family myth, was not merely gratitude or a trinket of conquest. It was a signal flare. If Venus mothered the Julian line, and Cleopatra appeared within Venus's house, then Cleopatra wasn't just an ally. She stood inside Caesar's imagined kinship, folded into his personal pantheon. Conservative senators saw, with perfect clarity, the sentences implied: monarchy with Mediterranean trappings, Rome's sacred spaces bending eastward, a general who thanked a queen in the language of gods, not the language of treaties. The statue didn't change a vote by itself. It changed the weather. Each time conspirators whispered about kingship, they had a golden figure to point at. Back in Alexandria, the alliance moved from myth into biology. A child was born, Ptolemy XV, whom Egyptians would call Caesarion, Little Caesar. In the palace nursery, the air smelled of frankincense and fresh linen. Outside it smelled of wet rope and sesame oil, and the sweet dust of crushed papyrus. Cleopatra staged motherhood, the way she staged everything. With intelligence and timing, she let the city see him as Horus, the divine son, swaddled in iconography older than the Ptolemies. She let Rome hear his name without forcing a declaration Caesar could not make. To the people along the Nile, he bound queen and land to the cycle of rebirth. To Cleopatra's ministers, he solved succession for a moment. To Roman ears already ringing with the word king, he was a rumor weaponized. Caesar never legally named the boy as heir. Rome had laws and enemies, but a gilded statue, and a child with his name standing on Egypt's balcony did as much damage as any proclamation. Between the crews and the cradle ran administration. Grain moved. Cleopatra calmed the canal crews, paid arrears, punished a clerk who fudged a measure, and ensured that the flood works downstream of Memphis were repaired before the water rose. Priests kept their rites smooth. The cults stamped the year with holy days. Soldiers garrisoned the right gates. Alexandria learned to breathe around Roman requirements without losing its own pulse. Caesar wrote letters to Rome that sounded like marble and inevitability. Cleopatra wrote orders in Demotic that sounded like storehouses and payroll. He stabilized his position in the West by letting the East be expertly tended. She stabilized her throne by tying her worth to his calm in the Forum. Each made the other's myth plausible. Politically, the romance worked because it was an instrument, not a costume. Caesar got from Cleopatra what no treaty could guarantee, in a city as inventive as hers: continuity. Not just shipments, but patronage networks that stayed aligned, temples that blessed taxes, guilds that didn't strike unless the queen told them myth required it. Cleopatra got from Caesar what no husband inside her dynasty could give: the one legitimacy that survives assassin's utility to a larger power. If Rome's grain dole landed on time, it argued for her, in Latin, without her ever standing in the Senate. The furious men on the Capitoline understood the arrangement too well. A gilded queen in Venus's temple was less obscene to them than efficient. Efficiency for Caesar meant irrelevance for them. In taverns near the Forum of Caesar, men muttered about crowns and couches and Eastern softness. In the Curia, more careful men whispered about lictors, legions, and the day when the word rex might be tested in public. Cleopatra likely knew her likeness had set teeth on edge. She also knew that a Rome enraged by a statue was still a Rome fed by her barges. She could live with fury. She could not live with famine, and neither could Caesar. For a season, the alliance made the world feel balanced. In Alexandria, the queen appeared on coins with a profile no engraver softened. In Rome, the dictator to be walked between honors and knives, certain that his control of bread had turned hunger into a client. Between them, a baby learned to close his fist around a bronze charm. The Nile rose and fell. The Tiber did the same. Spectacle had done its work, but beneath it, to schedule did more. The palace war was over. The river pageant had gilded the result. The statue in Rome kept talking long after the singers went hoarse, and in a crib behind blue-painted shutters, a dynastic thesis slept, that a queen could make a Caesar, and a Caesar could make a world in which she mattered more than marble ever would. Antony summoned a queen. A stage answered. He was in Tarsus, hot river town with walls that remembered Alexander, and streets jammed with traders who could price a man's sandals at a glance. The summons itself was Theatera, Roman triumvir, calling Cleopatra to account for where her ships had drifted during Rome's civil wars. She took his script, tore off the title page, and wrote a new first line. "You don't meet me in an audience hall. You meet me in a myth." Toward evening, the city drifted to the quays. following rumour to the river like iron to a lodestone. First came scent, cinnamon, myrrh, and Nile resin riding the breeze ahead of anything visible, the way thunder sometimes arrives before the cloud. Then sound, flutes in Phrygian modes, a rippling of strings, and the slow, mesmerizing pulse of frame drums. Not battle music, but invitation. At last the barge turned the bend. Purple sails caught the late sun and burned like poured wine. The oars, sheathed in silver, dipped and rose in time with the musicians, so that the whole river seemed to breathe. Beneath a cloth of gold canopy, Cleopatra reclined not as supplicant, but as apparition, skin gilded by dusk, hair bound with a serpent diadem, the barest chime of bracelets when she lifted a hand. Around her moved attendants costumed as sea nymphs and little Eros figures with fans of peacock and palm. On the prow, priests shook the sistrum. The I.sis rattle, so that the queen's entrance sounded like a shrine waking. Plutarch would later say she came as Aphrodite sailing to Dionysus. Alexandria would have recognized something both older and sharper. The Ptolemies, for generations, had practiced an imperial art called epiphany, the staged showing forth of a god through the body of a monarch. In the great Dionysian parades of earlier court festivals, bulls wore garlands, giant craters sloshed with wine, and ivy climbed over gold. Athenaeus preserved the recipe for astonishment. Cleopatra didn't need wagon towers or panthers to recall that grammar of awe. She braided iconographies, Hellenistic Aphrodite, to speak to Greek eyes, Egyptian Isis, to speak to the priesthood and the streets, a whisper of Dionysus, because Antony, soldier of appetites, had always been flattered by the rumour he could be a god of wine and war. This was stagecraft as statecraft, I.sis, the spectacle doing the political work of logos, the speech, so that by the time she stepped ashore, the conversation was already over. Antony sent a message, "Dine with me." She returned one, "Dine with me," which is to say, "You asked for an accounting. I'll furnish it, but you'll cross to my table to hear it." Power often begins with who makes whom walk. He came, the feast, like the arrival, was a solved equation. Roman need plus Egyptian surplus multiplied by timing. He needed money for legions, ships for Parthia, the credibility for a shaky Eastern command. She needed her debt to Rome, amortized into alliance, and her throne buffered against every regent with a dagger and a plan. So she fed him on plates that performed geography, Nile fish, glossed with honeyed wine, Syrian dates, Cilician citrus, as if the land itself were pledging its roots, and poured wine from jars, stamped with the eponymous year of a queen. Between courses, the air refreshed itself with frankincense. A ceiling cloth breathed a cooling breeze. Antony laughed like a man who had found himself in a world that had already accounted for his comfort. Read that entrance again with the cold eye of a quartermaster. Purple sails, not simply extravagance, but a Tyrian dye that screamed access to the near-mythic supply chains of Phoenician merchants. Whoever could spend colour like that could fund a campaign. Perfume on the wind, not merely seduction, but a message that her factories at Mendes and Canopus could turn sap and spice into a signature broadcast across water. The earliest propaganda, smell preceding sight, silvered oars, coin melted into motion, liquidity literalized, and the music, Dionysian timbre, for a man rumoured to enjoy being greeted as the god's earthly echo. If he was inclined to see himself as Bacchus, she would set the stage where Bacchus meets Aphrodite Isis, and make him the audience for his own legend. There was calculation beneath the gleam. Antony styled himself magnanimous in victory and generous in friendship, a man who could forgive yesterday for the sake of tomorrow's conquest. Cleopatra supplied the tomorrow, ships trimmed, harbours greased, pilots who knew shoals by the taste of the air, treasury rooms where the bronze sounded thick when a forearm knocked the amphorae. Her entrance did the work of a ledger. Her feast did the work of an oath. And yet it wasn't only sums. She was doing grammar. In the Hellenistic world, Appearance was an argument. A ruler's body, costumed with divine cues, could join mortal politics to cosmic order. I.sis was mother, healer, throne giver. Aphrodite was victory's sweetness, and the power of attraction turned into law. Dionysus was the god who shatters boundaries and returns with gifts. Wine, theatre, the ecstatic dissolution that makes a new order possible. Cleopatra put those signs into motion around herself. She didn't claim divinity outright to a Roman. She let the city of Tarsus behave as if a god had arrived, and let Antony decide whether to contradict a river full of witnesses. He didn't. He came aboard, as the summoned now turned the guest, and there are moments when power changes hands so gently, it leaves no fingerprint. He asked for explanations. He accepted a world. People later said she bewitched him. Bewitchment is the word used by those who don't wish to admit they were outplanned. He wanted funds. She gave him a festival that argued in 10 registers at once. He wanted obedience. She offered partnership, costumed as myth. He wanted the East to behave. She taught it to sing on cue. By night, the barge was lanterned, so that the water itself carried small moons. Antony lingered, not only for the satin and the wit, but because the evening had answered the question he had been pretending was about loyalty and was actually about logistics. Who can stabilize the routes while I try to make Parthia listen to Roman speech? The answer reclined beneath a canopy that made a throne out of shade. She could speak to the I.sis priests in pure Egyptian, to the Cilician dock guilds in their Greek, to Arab shippers in the trade's own dialect, to his officers in Latin softened by music. No interpreters, no delay, no rumor lost between tongues. The city's gossip turned the next morning's markets incandescent. Some said she had come with 1,000 lamps fed by cinnamon oil. Others swore the purple was so thick you could smell the dye. Sellers of figs priced them in Antony's virtue. Barbers trimmed beards, while arguing the fate of Rome. He had summoned her to be weighed. She had weighed him with scales no one could see, then pocketed the weights. When he finally left the barge, he was smiling like a man who had discovered that the quickest way to command a continent was to let its queen direct the overture. The meeting ended as it began, with Pageant doing policy. Antony scheduled another audience. Cleopatra scheduled another performance. The river, bribed by music, went on flowing east. The scent faded from the reeds. The purple sails were folded into their chests like secrets. But the argument remained, hung in the minds of soldiers and traders. If this is how she arrives, imagine how she governs. If she can make the Cydnus behave like the Nile, what might she make Rome do? In the ledger of that evening, the debit for awe matched the credit for control, and both were paid in full. Antony liked to call himself Philhellene, friend of the Greeks. Cleopatra offered him a friendship written in the alphabet of spectacle, with the footnotes in bullion. By the time his couriers galloped with orders towards Syria and Phoenicia, the balance had already shifted. He had not only chosen an ally, he had entered a story in which she was author, goddess, hostess, and banker. The sails came down. The myth stayed up. She understood that a face could be a flag. Cleopatra's toilette wasn't vanity. It was policy medicine, magic, and messaging braided into one ritual that told courtiers, priests, and foreign envoys exactly who ruled the room. Begin at the bath. Sour donkey's milk, warm to the edge of steam, poured over skin, grain by grain, until the queen gleamed. Servants rubbed her with linen and oil, sloughed yesterday's dust, and sealed the result with perfume. So particular it travelled before she did. The bath was not a sighing indulgence. It was an hour in which a monarch rehearsed sovereignty, every jar, an instrument, every scent, a signature, on the eyelids, kohl drawn in a sure, unequivocal line. In Egypt, that line did more than darken a gaze. It declared belonging to a civilization older than Rome's oldest oath. Marked the body with protection texts you could wear. Priests knew it. The street vendors knew it. The Greek quarter knew it, too, and kept watching. Lips and nails were stained with carmine and henna. Scents layered myrrh upon cinnamon, upon balsam, until the air around her behaved. Beauty here was not a private art. It was a broadcast. She liked recipes that worked twice. Almond oil softened skin, but in her hands it also signaled a farm's yield and a treasury's reach. Kaifi Egypt's temple incenses scented her rooms at dusk. It smoked a message to the priestly bureaucracy that this queen understood the calendar and the god's appetite for resinous prayer. Her personal perfume suite read like a map. Mendesian blends from Delta Labs, Metopian with its green, medicinal bite, the balsam that made En-Gedi famous. When Antony gifted her the balsam groves of Jericho and En-Gedi, she didn't just acquire a fragrance, she seized a monopoly. The sap that perfumed palaces and temples would henceforth pass through her accounts. If a Roman aristocrat smelled like cinnamon and balm, he smelled like Cleopatra's revenue. Those scents had logistics beneath the romance. Perfumery required presses, distilling pots, storage jars sealed with resin. Women who knew when a paste had matured by its color alone. The workshops at Mendes and Canopus were not boudoir operations. They were factories' payrolls. Recipes, quality control feeding court, temple, and export amphora alike. The queen could flood a banquet with the same note, or switch to a coastal blend for a Syrian legate who missed home, or pour kaifi into a shrine where priests read fragrance as text. She understood timing, fresh citrus for morning audiences, so talk felt easy, resin for negotiations that needed solemnity, and the full orchestra balsam, myrrh, storax when a god was meant to be present, and then the wager that turned chemistry into theatre. Pliny tells it like a moral, but Cleopatra told it like a joke that cost a kingdom. Antony bet she could not spend 10 million sesterces on a single meal. She served sparingly, almost plain. Then she removed an earring, one of those hemispheres of the sea, swollen with value, worth provinces, and dropped it into a goblet of vinegar. Acetic acid kisses calcium carbonate. A pearl softens, surrendas, vanishes into drinkable salt. She did not hesitate. She raised the cup and swallowed her wealth with steady eyes. One earring to close the bet, the other rescued by a steward's quick hands and Roman superstition. The cost was a story, and the dividend was legend. It wasn't mere flamboyance. The dissolved pearl said that price itself was obedient. If she could liquefy treasure at table, to imagine what she could do for an army's pay chests or a fleet's arrears. She could turn value into motion and back again. The Romans twitched at the extravagance. The East admired the control. Either way, her point landed. The queen drank money, the way Rome drank grain. Her arsenal went beyond baths and bets. There was talk of a cosmetic manual recipes for kohl, balms, depilatories, hair dyes copied and recopied until Roman writers could crib from it with disapproval and curiosity both. Whether that book survives in shreds or only in second-hand boasts, the culture around her makes it plausible. Egyptian chemistry was old. Apothecaries in Alexandria already blurred the line between pharmacy and perfumery. Temple workshops had been compounding ointments since before the Ptolemies dreamed in Greek. Cleopatra stood at the point where those streams met the court. She turned what women had known for centuries into statecraft. She understood spectacle at the scale of a pour, gold leaf, face masks at night, part ritual radiance, part rumour management, kohl on the lid's part glare shield, part spell, donkey milk part exfoliation, part parable about plenty. The chorus mocked the expense. The city learned to read the grammar. Kohl meant Egypt, balm meant monopoly, kaifi meant favour, almond oil meant the delta's orchards were thriving. Nothing was accidental. If the Nile ran rich, you could smell it. Even failures were curated. A rash hidden beneath linen the colour of pomegranate. A sleepless night corrected with a heavier veil and a heavier perfume. A rumour answered, not with a proclamation, but with a public appearance so composed that the rumour choked on its own breath. In a world that judged a woman's power by the tremor in a man's voice when he said her name, control of surface was control of narrative. Cleopatra made her body a stable currency. She minted herself daily, Consider the consuming logistics. Hundreds of donkeys maintained for milk, resin merchants bribed into punctuality, storage rooms cool enough to keep perfume from spoiling in Alexandria's furnace heat, servants trained to measure by scent, not spoon. The whole contraption ran like a treasury office with better lighting. Priests slipped in back corridors to place requests for temple incense. Greek aristocrats sent notes asking for a particular oil, like the one used at the Dionysia. Roman officers pretended to be above it until their letters home started to smell faintly of Mendes. It was politics by radius. You could walk through her presence and carry away proof, a hint of cinnamon in your beard, a thumbprint of kohl on your cuff, a sheen of oil on your wrist, so that when you later told the tale of what you had seen, your body corroborated your story. I was there. Your scent announced in the forum or the bathhouse. I stood within her weather. Jest. Even the austerity had a purpose. Sometimes she showed a bare face to the priests of Ptah, a way of saying, I am not merely a mask. The goddess is not a trick. Sometimes she went heavier for a Roman envoy who needed to be overwhelmed. Sometimes she wore the balm from Jericho deliberately, reminding Herod that he leased his wealth from her pleasure. Sometimes she switched to a local oil in Cyprus and watched the island merchants smile because a queen had remembered their groves. Beauty bought her time. Time bought her leverage. In an empire where men pretended politics only happened in the field or the Senate, Cleopatra proved that politics also happened at a mirror. Powder, oil, colour, scent. These were not feminine fripperies, but instruments tuned to an empire's pitch. She bathed. She drew her lines. She made the air choose a side. And by the time the day's audiences began, scribes, priests, captains, spies, her argument was already walking around her in circles, glittering softly, impossible to ignore. After Julius Caesar's funeral pyre burned down to rumours and ash, Cleopatra didn't wander grief, struck into history's shadows. She recalculated. Rome was splitting into pieces. Octavian tight-fisted on the Italian purse strings, Marcus Antonius holding the east with soldiers who loved him and creditors who didn't. Cleopatra read the map. The way a banker reads a ledger, she sailed back into Antony's life with money, ships, and the one commodity Rome never had enough of: certainty. He needed a treasury that could march. She needed a Roman who could make borders obey. By the time the grapevines of Alexandria whispered that the Roman general was wintering in the palace, the deal was already inked in wine, in strategy, in the knowledge that power adores a duet. The city responded first with gossip, and then with theatre. They founded a club, not a salon with poets nibbling olives, but an oath by banquet called the Inimitable Livers, a society with a single initiation rite. Live as if time had surrendered. They dined on Persian peaches chilled in snow, hauled from Mount Casius, drank wines labelled by year the way armies label legions, and chased supper with pranks that cost small kingdoms. When Antony's shoulders shook with laughter and Cleopatra's perfume turned the lamps gold, the club's joke thinned into policy. The city understood. The queen and the general were co-authoring a new calendar in which Rome would count its victories by Alexandrian festivals. Then came the policy behind the party. Antony's eastern settlement wasn't a love letter. It was a spreadsheet dressed as a triumph. He had inherited the Parthian problem Crassus's ghosts at Carrhae, eagles lost in sand, the steppe empire that taught Romans humility, and he meant to fix it. To campaign that far, he had to reorganize the East like an accountant clearing a desk. Client kings confirmed or replaced. Frontiers tightened. Supply lines costed. Herod got a crown that fitted Rome's purposes. Cities received charters. Debts were rolled. Ports re-tariffed. For all the purple, the general's pen moved cold. Cleopatra's money made that pen write straighter. Egypt's grain fed garrisons. Egypt's gold greased the mule trains. Egyptian shipwrights built hulls that could bully the Levantine coast into obedience. Antony was building an eastern machine, and the queen was the engine. But machine require stories. In 34 BCE, when Antony returned from Armenia, not with Parthian trophies, but with a rewritten narrative, He staged the Alexandrian triumph. Rome had rules about triumphs earned in Rome, awarded by the Senate, paraded to Jupiter's temple. Antony held his in Egypt. He processed through Alexandria in a chariot, prisoners tied, silver carried, trumpets telling a version of events in which almost sounded like done. Beside him, Cleopatra enthroned as I.sis, serene and terrifying, a goddess with accounts. On a raised dais, the children sat Alexander Helios the sun, Cleopatra Selene the moon. Later, little Ptolemy Philadelphus names that doubled as omens. He crowned them with maps. Lands were assigned not as hopes whispered to infants, but as titles shouted to a city. Armenia for one, parts of Syria and Cilicia for another. Cyrenaica and Crete like toys dropped into royal hands. Caesarion, her son by Julius, was proclaimed King of Kings. Cleopatra, Queen of Kings. Titles that bit. This was not romance. It was Antony's Eastern policy turned inside out for the crowd to see. Stabilize the frontier by making Egypt the keystone. Reward clients publicly, so loyalty calcified. Bind Rome's most resource. Rich neighbor to his fortunes by fusing dynastic spectacle with strategy. In Alexandria, it read as order with incense. In Rome, it read as treason with eyeliner. Octavian didn't have to invent a scandal. He curated it. Antony had a legal Roman wife, Octavia, dutiful, useful, sister to Octavian himself. When Antony sent her back pregnant once, and later with supplies he refused to accept, he handed his rival a moral cudgel. Add the coins Antony minted in the East, showing his portrait paired with Cleopatra's. Add the Egyptian regalia. Add the Alexandrian triumph. Pageantry, in Octavian's hands, became admissibly evidence. Look, he told a Senate hungry for outrage. This is a Roman general who crowns a foreign queen, who distributes provinces, like desserts, who dreams his funeral in Alexandria. Whether Antony's alleged will actually said that burial in Egypt, legacies to Cleopatra's children, mattered less than the performance of Octavian storming the Senate, brandishing the document he claimed to have ripped from the Vestal's vault. In politics, the reading is the fact. The donation of Alexandria was the hinge. It was Antony the administrator stapling territories to a dynasty that Rome had not authorized. Antony the showman, hardening policy into liturgy. Antony the husband, declaring that the eastern half of his heart belonged to a goddess with a treasury. His practical case that the East functions when the East feels honored, that frontiers stabilize when client kings believe their children have futures, was drowned by the chorus from the Forum, that he had surrendered to luxuria orientalis, that he lived not as a Roman, but as a slave to a woman. You can hear the cultural code words clatter, soft, perfumed, un-Roman. In truth, Antony was doing what Sulla and Pompey had done installing kings, refashioning borders, making the provinces pay. But he did it in a city that turned every policy into theatre. Beside a queen who understood theatre's voltage, Octavian held up the playbill and called it a confession. Meanwhile, the domestic stakes grew new fangs. The twins legitimized a future that Octavian could not abide. If Caesarion was truly Julius Caesar's son, then Octavian adopted, legal, inconvenient, had a rival who could unwrite him. Cleopatra pressed that claim with coins, titles, a boy's schooling designed to look like destiny. Antony, whether out of conviction or calculation, amplified it when he could. Roman ears translated every whisper into sedition. And still, the inimitable livers drank and plotted. The club was more than a private joke. It was hospitality as soft power, a way to keep generals soothed, scholars flattered, Captain loyal, and Alexandria feeling like the capital of things. They rebranded themselves, morbidly, as those who will die together. When the weather turned, the joke had changed key. They could feel Octavian's patience thinning, legions drilling across the sea, a propaganda machine finding its rhythm. Cleopatra adjusted the lighting and the ledger. Antony reviewed dispositions and dreamed of finishing Parthia properly next time. Their knights mixed sugar with iron. Remember the through line. Antony was not seduced into policy. He brought a policy that required seduction. To govern the East, you must speak the East, reward it, ritualize it, wrap it in gold, and promise. He made Alexandria a stage because his strategy needed believers. Cleopatra provided the chorus and the cash box. In another world, one without Octavian consolidating Italy, without the Senate tired of being mocked, without a Roman public primed to fear queens, Antony might have sold it as statecraft crowned with courtesy. In this world, the show became the charge. Every procession, a precedent against him. Every diadem placed on a child's head, a brief for the prosecution. Every banquet note cinnamon, balsam, wine and affidavit filed in the court of Roman opinion. When Octavian finally went for the throat, he didn't argue law, he argued identity. He promised to rescue Rome from a foreign queen and the Roman who loved her. He made the war about a woman, so it could feel like a crusade about Rome. And the evidence he carried into that crusade was not dispatches but images. The barge, the crowns, the children with cosmic names, the goddess on a throne beside a general who should have preferred a curule chair. The banquet became a writ, the mask became a warrant, the inimitable livers became exhibits A through Z. By the time the fleets assembled and the world narrowed to a strait called Actium, the verdict in Roman hearts had already hardened. The trial had been held at 1,000 dinners. The testimonies were songs, processions, jewels. The judge was a young man who could keep a straight face while promising restoration. Antony and Cleopatra would have to win a war to overturn a story. The odds were not good. Stories, when they calcify, outfight legion. In the last days, Cleopatra became her own physician, her own dramaturge, her own juror. The court had always accused her of alchemy perfumes that swayed generals, cosmetics that rewrote faces. But what she studied now was chemistry with only one desired end. Roman writers, who loved a sordid footnote, say she tested poisons on condemned prisoners and watched, cool and precise, for what killed without convulsions. It reads like slander until you recall the stakes. Octavian intended her alive for Rome, paraded through a triumph as a living punctuation mark at the end of Antony. Cleopatra meant to author her final scene herself. Research, in that light, is not cruelty. It is control. The asp enters as if on cue. Plutarch's story that launched 1,000 paintings, a basket of figs delivered to the queen's chamber, a hidden Egyptian cobra coaxed from fruit into history, a clean bite, the last sovereign of the Nile, closing her eyes like a curtain. Rome adored that version. It made for marble, exotic, symbolic, strangely chaste. It also solved several Octavian problems at once. If she died by her own hand, he did not have to murder a queen in chains and risk turning pity into revolt. If she died by an Egyptian emblem, he could package the whole war as Rome, bringing order to superstition. The asp story is propaganda and poetry. At the same time, rarely do political needs and mythic imagery hold hands so neatly. But theatre gets messy when you ask it to do logistics. Egyptian cobras are not props that bite on cue. They are large, temperamental, and reluctant to strike unless pressed. When they do, venom dosage varies wildly. One bite might numb a limb, another might be dry. For a synchronized death of 3 women, Cleopatra and her 2 handmaidens, the snake would need to cooperate with clockwork that serpents don't keep. There are practical questions. 2. How was it carried? Who handled it? Who avoided being bitten during delivery? Even ancient sources hedge, offering alternates, a toxic comb, a hollowed hairpin that pricked like a kiss, a vial worked into an ointment, a blade dipped in something that slept the blood. Octavian's incentives clarify the staging. He wanted her dead, but respectably, at a remove. A public execution courts sympathy and scandal. A captive queen on his triumphal chariot courts danger, an unpredictable Roman crowd, and a woman infamous for turning rooms in her favour. Better, then, a tidy, foreign-seeming death that keeps his hands clean. And the narrative obedient, she chose the snake of her gods. Rome granted her the dignity of her own ending. His biographers would repeat it with the self-satisfaction of men who know a tidy story will outlive a complicated truth. Cleopatra's incentives, on the other hand, reduced to one line, deny Rome her body as spectacle. She had spent 2 decades choreographing arrivals. She would choreograph the departure. That is why the prisoner experiments ring plausible. She needed a method that delivered certainty, speed, and face. A queen does not gamble the last sentence of her life on a reptile's mood. When you sought the ancient pharmacopoeia by effect rather than mystique, a more clinical picture emerges. Hemlock, the Athenian executioner's choice, paralyzes from the extremities inward, cool and numbing, with a window of 1 to 3 hours, depending on dose and stomach contents. It is stately but slow, a death, with pauses. Opium, abundant in Hellenistic medicine, sedates and suppresses breath. High doses can bring sleep that deepens into silence. It is clean if prepared correctly and taken swiftly, but tolerance and potency vary. It's also conspicuous. Drowsiness, snoring respirations, a slack mouth the Romans would have mocked. Aconite wolfsbane acts fast and ugly, tingling lips, burning throat. Arrhythmias? Collapse can come in minutes, but so can vomiting, convulsions, and a face that tells on you, not a queen's exit. Arsenic, corrosive sublimate, and other mineral poisons are brutal and slow, tearing the gut, wringing the body. They announce themselves with agony. Cleopatra had prided herself on spectacle. She would not pick one that made her writhe for a hostile audience. Snake venom, what of the cobra? Egyptian naya higher venom is primarily neurotoxic. It can kill in under an hour by shutting down the diaphragm, but more commonly, the course runs longer and uneven, especially with a single bite. Drooping eyelids, salivation, progressive weakness, fear. Bites leave marks. Envenomation is a dice roll with a loaded table. The cleaner poison theory isn't a modern killjoy. It is a queen's calculus. An opium hemlock cocktail could have layered sedation atop descending paralysis, turning the Socratic chill into sleep. A topical toxin pricked under a bracelet could have worked quickly without drama. A hidden hollow pin, charged with a paste of opiates and plant alkaloids, could pierce skin beneath jewelry, with no one the wiser until it was too late. Meanwhile, Octavian's tidy narrative did its work. He entered the tomb and found her, adorned as she lay, is how one strain of the story runs. With the asp discovered after, still curling among the figs like punctuation, another strain has him anxiously sending physicians and antidotes, playing the merciful conqueror, while news raced ahead that she had escaped his show. Compassion is a useful costume on the eve of a triumph. His next acts were all about inventory and erasure, securing the treasury, neutralizing Caesarion, dispatching letters that framed the war not as a Roman civil war, won by a shrewd young heir, but as a foreign campaign that had purified Rome of a queen's enchantments. A snake served that framing better than a draft. One detail, often overlooked, complicates the cobra. 2 attendants, Charmian and Erasti, with her. Ancient versions catch Charmian adjusting the diadem on the dead queen's brow when Octavian's men burst in, a gesture so choreographed it feels truer than the biology beneath it. Synchronizing 3 deaths with a snake is folly. Synchronizing with a measured draught is simple. Give each woman her cup. The queen drinks last. The loyal see to the crown. There is also the matter of iconography. The uraeus, the rearing cobra, was Egypt's royal sign, pinned above pharaonic brows, spitting fire at enemies in temple reliefs. An asp narrative, while exotically convenient for Rome, also baptizes Cleopatra's death in Egyptian sovereignty. Was Octavian so clever he could afford ambivalence? Perhaps. Or perhaps myth just outruns motive because it photographs better. A hidden pin does not paint like a serpent against figs. History has a bias for images that can be carved in stone. We will not exhume certainty from 2 millennia of rumor. What we can say is this: Cleopatra spent her life translating ritual into power, chemistry into theater. In the end, she likely did the same. chose a preparation over a performance, then allowed Rome the illusion of a snake. Octavian needed a story that made him restorer, not strangler. She needed an exit that made her sovereign to the last. Both won, in the only court that counts. He processed his triumph. She edited her ending. So picture the chamber stripped of legend. The queen sits calm. The last papers sealed. The coffers counted. The boy's fate already moving toward its dreadful logic. She lifts a small vial, or draws a pin across skin. The attendants drink. Breath slows. Hands steady the diadem one last time. Outside, Rome's future collects itself for a parade. Inside, a lifetime of choreography ends on a gesture so quiet that a poet had to invent a snake to make it loud. Octavian arrives in Alexandria with two problems: a war he won but cannot name, and a queen whose charisma could still upstage him even in death. His answer is narrative engineering. He turns a Roman civil war, Roman against Roman, into a foreign victory over Egypt. He coins the bumper sticker first, AEGVP2 captor, stamped into silver, tiny triumphs, jingling in every hand. He plans a parade in which her children, royal toddlers turned trophies, will walk in chains. Not because they are dangerous, but because symbols travel farther than soldiers. He drafts himself as restorer of the Republic, then edits out the Republic part, and keeps the restorer. This is the story machine at work. Rename the war. Rename the woman. Cleopatra is recast from ruler into Eastern enchantress, the sorceress whose perfume made men weak, and whose money made them traitors. Make the enemy a seduction, and you sanctify the conqueror as a cure. Latin poetry picks up the baton. In Virgil's Aeneid, Actium is not a naval battle, but a cosmic exorcism. Augustus radiant, Apollo on his side, while monstrous Easterners, Cleopatra among them, churn the sea. Horace uncorks his celebration with Nunc est bibendum. Now we must drink, calling her a fatale monstrum. Then, in a twist, Roman readers noticed, granting her a sliver of respect for choosing death on her terms. Even in victory songs, the outline of a strategist shows through, but the chorus drowns it. The Rome that needed Augustus also needed Cleopatra to be the reason Augustus was necessary. The prose historians fix the template. Plutarch, generous and curious, records her wit and languages, but also preserves the stories that make good theatre. The carpet, the pearl, the asple. Because moralists and audiences alike remember parables better than policies. Cassius Dio turns nuance into spectacle. More jewels, brighter bargus, louder downfire. Suetonius adds the cruel epigram that Octavian used to justify the killing of Caesarion. It is not good to have too many Caesars align. So neat, it feels pre-polished for schoolroom recitation. What endures isn't the grain tallies she stabilized, or the priestly coalition she managed, but the tableau, the sorceress queen who drank treasure and died by snake. Medieval Europe inherits the silhouette, files off the politics, and shelves Cleopatra among exemplar. Women who prove what happens when appetite meets power. Boccaccio lists her in his book of famous women as a cautionary figure. Illuminated margins replace the Nile with a bedchamber, and the diadem with a moral caption. The Middle Ages didn't need her policy. They needed a proverb. Then the Renaissance cracks the glass. Humanists rediscover Plutarch. Artists rediscover marble. Cleopatra returns in oils and tragedy, where she is bigger than a sermon, but still bound by a frame. Shakespeare gives her the most generous resurrection before modernity. Not a witch, not a saint, but a sovereign made of nerve and nerve's price. His Antony and Cleopatra is a debate in verse about how charisma and empire destroy each other, and she wins as often as she loses. Age cannot wither her, he writes, and you can feel a poet trying to repair 2 centuries of caricature with one line of oxygen. Yet even here, the Roman lens lingers. Honor is the coin, Rome the judge, and Egypt, a stage set scented for the trial. Painters go to work. Poussin and Tiepolo, Cabanel and Alma Tadema compose her final minutes with faultless drapery and obedient serpents. The asp becomes a prop you can arrange to flatter a wrist. Orientalism arrives wearing velvet. Cleopatra is a canvas on which Europe rehearses fantasies about the East luxury. Languor, danger you can purchase by the frame. Archaeology stokes the appetite. Egyptomania feathers it. The queen becomes a brand again, this time for other people's salons. Hollywood inherits both the brand and the bill. Claudette Colbert's 1934 Cleopatra is the Depression's shimmer, Art Deco Nile, innuendo, and a queen whose wisecracks are as sharp as her eyeliner. Elizabeth Taylor's 1963 epic bankrupts almost everything except the myth, turning a budget into a spectacle that finally matches the Roman rumour. The film is excess, as argument exactly what Augustus swore he had rescued Rome from, and in that sense it is historically faithful to the propaganda. It unconsciously echoes, yet within the gowns and golden barges, actresses sneak back. What poets lost? A calculating mind, a ruler's patience, a woman who knows when a room turns and why. Modern scholarship, quieter than cinema, but louder over time, reassembles the person behind the paint. Papyrus fragments, coin legends, temple reliefs, and the administrative record of a city that never slept reveal an executive with fluency as policy, a negotiator who understood that priestly bureaucracies are won in their own idioms, and a monarch who leveraged famine relief and river transport to bargain with Rome. She stops being merely the woman who loved famous men, and returns as the sovereign famous men had to love or fear. If Cleopatra did author a cosmetic or medical manual, as Galen and Pliny suggest, its loss is painfully ordinary. Women's technical texts vanished because scribes copied what fit the canon. Monasteries preserved theology over domestic science, and conquerors rarely curate the libraries of the conquered, and the afterlife keeps mutating, a mirror held up to whoever is looking. In the 19th century, she is decadence punished. In the early 20th, glamour with a sting. In the late 20th, a feminist icon or an Orientalist cautionary tale, depending on who is holding the camera. In the 21st, debates about her complexion and ancestry turn casting choices into referenda about identity, empire, and who gets to claim antiquity. Each generation edits her for its anxieties. Rome feared the foreign queen. Victorians feared appetite. Mid-century studios worshipped spectacle. Our moment interrogates authorship, race, and the politics of desire. The constant is not Cleopatra. The constant is us. Octavian's machine worked in the short term. He processed his triumph. He bound the state to his name. He taught the world to call his enemy by the slur he preferred. But Erasua's leak, the archival Cleopatra multilingual, devout when useful, impious when necessary, ferociously pragmatic, keeps glinting through the gilded haze, in priestly decrees that name her as pharaoh, in tax registers that show policy, in coins that marry Greek legends to Egyptian crowns. She is both the woman Rome advertised and the woman Rome needed you not to see, which is why she survives. Picture, finally, two statues, Augustus in marble, smooth, state-sponsored, facing a forum. Cleopatra in a chipped limestone bust, provenance uncertain, face half-ruined. One was made to be permanent, the other to be forgotten. 2,000 years later, both speak, but one draws questions. That is the failure and the success of propaganda at once. Augustan Rome wrote her as seductress so completely that artists, poets, and directors never stopped rewriting her back. The afterlife Octavian scripted became the argument she keeps winning by refusing to end. Strip the legend down to tools and choices, and Cleopatra stops being a spell and becomes a working monarch with a frighteningly modern brief. Hold a cosmopolitan port city together during famine cycles. Arbitrate priestly politics. Stabilize coinage and credit. Keep an army loyal. Keep Rome interested but not devouring. Turn identity into policy. Turn policy into story. The head count of her gifts, languages, ceremony, logistics. Audacity reads less like a seductress's prop list than a stateswoman's kit. Start with a thing that looks most like sorcery and least like work. Her voice. Cleopatra was her own interpreter, which meant no delay, no leakage, no flattery lost in transit. She could move from Greek legalese with Alexandrian bankers to Temple Egyptian with scribes measuring the flood to brisk Latin with a Roman legate who thought translators were leverage. The effect was not just charm, it was efficiency. Speech, for here, was a tool of budget and border. She knew the priesthood preferenced piety in their own syntax, so she gave them I.sis in their own words, not as costume alone, but as paperwork, decrees that married Greek titles to pharaonic cartouches and left the scribes with nothing to correct and everything to endorse. Fluency is faster than patronage. It also looks like magic if you don't have it. Then, the thing that looks most like play and is in fact administration. Perfume, pigment, the brand. The queen who bathed in donkey milk and lined her eyes with kohl knew she was staging more than a complexion. Lactic acid softens skin. Kohl cuts glare and charms the gods. But its real utility for Cleopatra was semiotic. She composed herself the city could read at a distance. The Isis diadem, the Nile greens, the cinnamon airs that preceded an audience by a heartbeat, announcing not just a body but a regime. Scent and sight are older than law. She used both as preamble to policy. This is what Roman writers couldn't forgive, that a woman could make aesthetics, do the work of edicts, add the thing least glamorous and most decisive. Water. Cleopatra was a sailor queen by necessity. Egypt's wealth moved on the river. Its peace depended on grain barges, leaving on time and arriving intact. She knew the Nile's moods, the harbour's factional topography, the pilot's bribes, the places where a galley could turn and where it could not. When Rome shook, she didn't only send love letters, she sent ships. She understood that Roman politics ran on bread and theatre. She controlled half the equation. Promised grain buys patience in senates and silence in streets. Withheld grain writes its own editorial. A barge is propaganda when it moves on schedule. Now the thing people remember as theatre and miss as strategy. Pageantry, the carpet, the purple sails, in the pearl in vinegar. These are not random gusto, they are arguments. The rolled rug entrance tells Caesar she can read a room and beat a blockade with a joke. The Tarsus barge tells Antony she commands a city that manufactures wonder as easily as rope. The dissolved pearl tells everyone that price is a language she speaks as fluently as law. The donations of Alexandria, staged with crowns and children on a raised platform, tells rivals she understands succession optics, as well as any Roman. If Rome runs on spectacle, she will raise a stage of her own and dare them to blink. Pageant is policy condensed into a minute. You cannot forget. That instinct for condensation bled into coin. Look at the silver. Her profile hard-lined, the nose unflattered, the chin forceful, paired with Greek legends and Egyptian symbols. Not beauty propaganda, authority propaganda. A queen who orders her die cutters not to sweeten her face advertises a different currency. I am not a poem. I am a weight. Coins are the only speeches that survive every fire. She spoke with them. Her courtcraft was less about cushions and more about choreography. Alexandria was a city of militias, philosophers, priests, sailors, tax farmers, and imported Roman tempers. Regents made markets out of regicide. Scribes could tolerably ruin you with a footnote. Dockworkers could paralyze a kingdom by refusing to load. Cleopatra kept them talking to her rather than to one another. She bought loyalty where it was cheapest in ritual, in predictable paydays, in seeing the queen where people actually lived. The great myth is that she bewitched individual men. The quieter truth is that she managed crowds, the more difficult spell, and yet, even at the scale of one room, she understood chemistry in the unromantic sense. Which elements, when mixed, release heat. Julius Caesar arrived, needing grain and proof that he could arbitrate a foreign quarrel like a god. Give him both, and he will give you medals. Antony arrived, needing money, legitimacy, and a stage to be Antony on. Give him all three, and he will empty Rome's pockets into your sea. She did not invent their weaknesses, She instrumented them. Rome later called that witchcraft. We call it psychology when men do it. Her failures were also human, not mythic. Actium, stripped of legend, is logistics meeting weather. And will, heavy ships against lighter. A battle plan that asked two egos to coordinate under stress. A wind that favored retreat once fear entered the calculation. She had gambled before and won. Here she gambled and fled, perhaps too early, perhaps at the right time for the wrong history. The rusum of any ruler includes the day the system you built can no longer bear the weight of its own alliances. Cleopatra's was written at sea, and then the survivalist. A queen besides herself would have run, sued for temple asylum, vanished into a shrine. Cleopatra held a last council, inventoried what could still be made meaningful, and chose a story over capture. Whether snake, salve, or cup, the act is the same. I will not be paraded. It was the final use of stagecraft against a system that loved stages. Octavian preferred her dead. She preferred to die as a verb, she authored. The Romans filed the scene under tragic ornament, but the camera she planted stayed on. Why does she remain threatening and enchanting? Because she performed power through systems men were trained to call trivial. Language. Her policy moved at the speed of her mouth. Scent. She understood that smell trespasses the intellect and settles in memory. Stage. She accepted that seeing is believing and made herself the most disciplined object ever seen. Combine those with competent state work grain, ships, priests, pay, and you have a political technology. Rome could neither replicate nor dignify. To call it sex was safer, and she is a mirror. Hold Cleopatra up to any era, and it reveals what that era thinks women in power should be punished or praised for. The Romans feared a foreign ruler who argued better than their men and funded navies from a city they mocked and needed. Victorians feared appetite and made her punishment erotic. Mid-century Hollywood worshipped audacity and turned her budgets into a morality tale. Our own moment interrogates the archive that misnamed her. Who wrote this? Whose handwriting survives? Which bodies were called excess when their competence became embarrassing? In that interrogation, Cleopatra is less a heroine than a diagnostic and ancient case study of how a woman's visible tools are mislabeled as vice. Return to the working monarch. You can see her in a harbour office at dusk, heat still radiating from stone, oil lamps throwing that honeyed light on papyrus. A harbour captain reports a jam upriver. The head of the priestly college requests an exemption for a festival. A Roman courier waits with a face like paperwork. She listens, she signs, she lifts a hand, and a clerk runs. Because this is a city that believes a gesture means something will happen. That is rule. It smells faintly of cinnamon, because the queen has been in ceremony since noon, and the fragrance won't leave her hair. But the room's real perfume is velocity problems recognized, redirected, solved, disguised. The myth wants incense. The archive offers ink. Between them is the human queen, scholar of men and gods, sailor on a silk-brown river, propagandist who made proofs from silk, survivor who would not be made into a triumph float. She is both the author and the argument, and the reason she can't be filed away is not that she was exceptional, though she was, but that her method remains recognizable. Speak firsthand. Stage what you mean. Smell like tomorrow. Her enemies rewrote her into a cautionary tale. Her survival instinct rewrote the world's appetite for her. So the last image is not a snake or a kiss on a deck. It is a coin in a palm, warm from the skin, stamped with a profile that refuses flattery. It buys bread. It pays a soldier. It travels farther than rumor. 2 millennia later, you can still read the name. It reads like a claim and like a question. How much of this was power, and how much was performance used as power because other tools were barred? The answer is in the metal. She made both spend. That is why she endures, and why the room still turns when you say her name. Before the sun has the courage to climb the ridge, she is already awake. The hearth is a low red eye, the peat smelling of earth and old smoke. Beside it, a lidded pot clinks faintly with last night's broth. She knots her hair, lifts the iron hook, swings on the kettle, and starts the day the way all Highland days begin, by deciding who eats, who works, and what gets saved from the weather. Men ride to feud and council. She keeps a country moving. The yard is rime brittle, the cow's breath white in the dark, hands on udders, forehead against flank. She milks by feel, quick and steady, the tin pail ringing soft with each letdown. A girl 12 or so, old enough to be kneaded, strains the milk into a cool stone crook. Another salts the butter churn and sets it by the door where the air is sharp. There will be cheese later. A soft white wheel, muslin wrapped, and hung on a nail. One more circle of calories banked against a thin winter. The hens complain at nothing in particular. She scatters handfuls of grain, just enough to quiet them, not enough to be wasteful. A woman counts without looking like she counts. Inside, the day's ledger waits a board scored with last Martinmas rents. A horn notebook speckled with grease and ash. She runs her finger down the columns. Oats due, fleece due, coin due. Some tenants will pay in butter, some in days of labour, some in cattle feet. Walking to market comes summer value measured by hooves still attached. She knows who is late because a child is sick, who is late because he drank it all in a week, who is late because the river took his fence and the neighbours never came. She can be stern, she is often merciful, both a policy. The first messenger thumps the door with his boot. He is a gilly of her husband's cousin, wind-chapped. Careful, the men have gone north to haggle a blood price. They want news of oats and whether she can spare 3 lads for a cattle drive next month. She gives the oats report in one breath, and the weather's truth in another. The bad is a category here, and the lads will be spared if the driver promises them home by Pentecost. She sends him back with bannocks wrapped in a cloth, and a note sealed with a warm blob of red wax. Her hand, hier decision, authority, leaves the room on other people's boots. By full light, the tenants begin to arrive. The first, a widow with 2 bairns and a back like a bent bow, places a basket on the table, curds, a hen, and a promise to card wool for the manor cloth. The next, a big man with hay in his beard, lays down a stack of spun hanks and stares like a horse being shod. She weighs each skein with the scale that hangs from the rafters. Its pans blackened from years of judgment, and notes the weight. She does not cheat. She does not need to. The room knows the scale is fair, and that is worth more than one man's cleverness. Mid-morning is for rounds. Fields, by foot. She walks the boundary wall, where it sags from frost, taps it with a staff, sets boys to haul stone. She stops at a byre and points to a cough in a cow. Mash the oats warm, add a spoon of nettle, keep her under thatch. And 2 women nod, already listing what else the house must do. In the dye shed, skein steam in a vat of heather and lichen. She dips a finger, tests the heat, sniffs the mordant. The colour will hold, the wool will sell. Her work is not a chain, it is a braid food. Cloth, favour. At the edge of the great room, a musket rests on hooks above the hearth, powder horn kept dry in a leather pouch. The dirk sits sheathed under the settle where the littlest boys cannot reach. A polearm leans in the shadows, its steel oiled with tallow, not because war is glorious, but because raiders are not a metaphor. Once, years ago, she poured a kettle of boiling oatmeal from an upstairs slit onto hands that gripped the wall. She has not told that story twice. Everyone remembers. Noon is for counting, and for court. A tackman from a hill glen stands in the doorway like bad weather. He owes 2 cattle, offers 1, and brings reasons the bridge washed out. The grazer died. A cousine stole. She listens, hands folded, eyes bright. Then she speaks in the only currency the Highlands respect. A solution. Leave the 1 beast in the lower pen. Send 2 lads to our hay in the west field till the new moon. I'll take the grass as your second. If you miss the moon, I take your ewes next lamb. He bows because the terms are hard and fair, and that is the shape of survival. Visitors arrive unannounced, because that is the point of rank. A cousin by marriage, damp from the road, and bursting with someone else's gossip, must be fed. Hospitality is not courtesy, it is sovereignty. She sets a boy running for ale, another for cold meat, and takes the cousin's temperature in the old Highland way. How much does she eat before she lies? If the cousin speaks of reconciliation, there is a wedding somewhere and a trap. If she speaks of outrage, there is a raid brewing and a useful errand. Either way, the table buys her a story. Afternoon bends toward cloth and children. She sits by the window where light is best and supervises spinning. The wheel's whisper is a kind of prayer, a rhythm of enoughness. A girl snags the thread and swears under her breath. An older woman smirks and hides a smile. She tells, because telling is a job, the story of the year. The snow came early, and the men came home late, and 4 women cut peat by themselves until their hands bled and the fire never went out. The girls listen. You cannot keep a culture in a chest. You must carry it in a mouth. There is always a crisis. A pig loose in the kale, a boy with a split scalp, blood ribboning down his ear, a cow down in a ditch with its legs in the wrong directions. She triages, pig first. Kale is rent turned green. She makes a gate with bodies and shouts, until the pig remembers it is smaller than a wall. Then the boy. She washes the cut with hot water that smells of rosemary and something bitter, the healer left, pinches the edges together, ties a crosshatch with clean thread, and sends him back out with a warning and a kiss he pretends not to want. The cow will take 4 people, and a rope, which she has, and a prayer, which she also has. She crosses herself because the church asks it. She spits over her left shoulder because her grandmother asked that, too. The Highlands are big enough for both. Toward evening, the drover arrives with his hat in his hands and bad arithmetic in his eyes. 3 head were promised. 2 are here. Wolves, he says. She looks at the mud dried on his boots and the wool on his cuff, at the way he does not meet her eyes, and knows the truth. Is 2 nights lost at cards, and 1 night lost to pride. She could flay him with a word. She could cast him out. Instead, she measures the man against the winter, sees his sister who helps with carving, and his mother who sings at funerals, and finds him in labour. And the next firstborn calf. Mercy here is not softness. It is the mathematics of a valley. Dusk rolls in with weather and with priests. Father Mac sharp-eyed. Poor. Political comes for the tithe. 1 in 10 of what passes the door. She has 3 sacks counted, 1 hidden, 1 already paid forward to a family who will not make February without it. She pays 2, barters the 3rd for prayers for a kinsman on the road, and sends the priest away with a loaf and less than he wanted. God keeps a book. So does she. The saints understand. Night is for steel. After the children fall asleep under a roof that leaks in one corner and knows every star by sound, she lifts the musket, checks the flint, measures powder into the pan by feel. She runs a rag through the barrel and hangs it again above the hearth, where heat and smoke keep it dry. She pulls the dirk, bares the edge with a whetstone, and sets it back. She looks to the door bar and the shutter peg, and finally to the thin place in the north wall where the wind sneaks through. She shoves a twist of wool in and pats it like a pet. Defense here is layers wood, iron, rumour. When the men are gone a long time, when the gossip grows teeth, when riders have been seen on the high path and their faces were not ours, she sleeps in her gown with her shoes beside the bed and her hand on the knife. She dreams anyway. In the dream she is at the long table on a day in summer when melons were a miracle, and the cheese finished properly and the children rolled down the hill until they were grass green and laughing. In the dream she is also at the window in a winter that lasted 2 months too long, counting sacks in her head while she smiles and tells a story to stop the crying. The Highlands are 2 truths held at once. The beauty that breaks you and the grit that saves you, at last because day always ends, even for the ones who never sit down. She writes 1 more line in the ledger by firelight. Rent 2 stones of meal, 1 fleece, promise of labour. She blows the ink dry and closes the book and lets her shoulders remember they are bone and not just duty. Outside, the wind combs the heather. Somewhere beyond the dark, men talk loudly and call it politics. Here, she has already decided a dozen futures and moved them where they need to go. Invisible chieftain is not a metaphor. It is a job description. Tomorrow, the dairy at dawn, the accounts, the tenants, the weapons by the hearth. The ridge will be the same. The work will be different. That is how a place survives wars it does not start, and songs it refuses to forget. And when the riders finally return, wet and proud, and full of the story of themselves, they will find roofs that held children with full bellies, a herd counted and mended, and a woman who will listen and nod and not mention that she fought a battle here with nothing but a kettle, a ledger, and a look. Let the world count chiefs by swords. This valley knows better. In a land where cattle were currency and memory was law, matrons drew the map. Men could ride out and take a hill for an afternoon. Women stitched valleys together for generations. Marriage was their longest blade. A match could stop a feud. No chief could quell or salt it so thoroughly that sons yet unborn would be baptized into grievance. The clan called the chief father, but the alliance maker, the talk counter, the reader of rooms, was very often a mother. She knew that a wedding was not romance. It was logistics. First came blood and canon, were the two within degrees of kin that would require a bishop's paper. A shrewd matron kept a priest pliant, a notary sober, and a cousin in the cathedral to usher dispensations through. Next came terms, the tocha, the dowry in cattle, coin, textiles. Sometimes grazing rights moved one way, the mourning, gift and jointure lands moved the other, securing the bride's lifetime maintenance should widowhood arrive early. As it often did, a clever woman never sent a daughter without land or revenue pinned to her name like a brooch. That pin was not jewelry. It was a lifeboat. Jointure could be a stack of charters, tucked into a chest, each with a wax pendant seal. The mill of Glenfean, the salmon net at the ford, 3 acres of infield by the Ash. Possession is 9 parts of the law. Paper is the 10th. She made certain both existed. If the groom's people promised a dower house, she would walk its floorboards herself, kick the skirting, eye the roofline, ask how often the burn took the bridge. Romance does not mend a thatch. Fosterage was the other quiet engine. To end a blood quarrel, a woman might offer her toddler son to be raised in the rival house, and take theirs in return. It seems paradox. Send your heart to the enemy, but a child in your hall guarantees restraint. Hurt him, and you collapse the truce. Love him, and you have bound future loyalties with cradle twine. Matrons planned these exchanges as if they were troop movements. Nurses chosen, tutors named, holidays scheduled, gifts sent on saint days until affection set like mortar. And because the Highlands loved theatre almost as much as they feared hunger, everything at a betrothal spoke. Where the bride sat at the feast, whether the groom's mother rose to meet her, or made her wait a breath too long, how many torches lit the yard, how many stags were carved, and which guests were given, which cuts, what tune began the first dance. In hands like hers, pageantry ran on purpose. A seating plan could be a treaty, a slight could be a declaration of war with gravy. The dowry itself was not just cattle tails and plaid lengths. It could be a promise to cease raiding a particular pasture for 3 summers, or to share the cutting of peat on a disputed bog. It might be the lending of 20 men at harvest, if weather turned against the other house. She wrote such clauses with her mouth as much as any clerk's pen. We will send help if the barley lies, and you will send a boat if the river takes the ford. Generosity looked like kindness. It was insurance. Feud fanning was not beneath her, if it guarded what mattered. If a cousin had been killed, and the other house offered an assithment compensation too lean, she might stand up at a christening and sing a lament that named no names, yet named everyone, the air thick with the memory of a boy's broken jaw and a mother's black dress. Pity can be policy, so can a song sharpened into a spear, a microvignette. Then, to show the knife edge on which such women worked, the long table smells of beeswax and smoke. The ash in the hearth is grey as old coin. On one side sits Amnikian e-chain, hair braided with a ribbon, the colour of wet heather, hands folded on a stack of folded papers, On the other sits Eyre of the narrow glen, small, watchful, a ring of keys on her belt. Each has brought one son and no husband. This is by design. Emzar speaks first, because she can afford to. We would make peace. She says, "You're Alastair, and my Elspeth. Spring, after the last frost." Emiri nods. Silence settles and hums. She knows the weight of silence better than most men know a sword. Then, soft, "Aye, if peace has legs." She looks at the bundle at Mer's elbow. "Show me its shoes." "Oh dear." Mer opens the top paper, a list in a neat clerk's hand, her own annotations curling like thorns. 30 head, 2 to be milkers, 16 plate lengths, dyed and fulled, a chest of linen, 12 fine, 12 coarse, 1 silver cup here. The cup appears, notched with a hawk on its lip, from my mother's house. She pauses, and the grazing on the east bank for 6 weeks each summer for 5 summers, marked, witnessed, dios. There is a slow intake of breath from the younger men. Grazing rites are meat and marrow. Miri moves 1 key from ring to fist, turning it with her thumb. "And when Alastair is made to ride with your men," she says. "When, not if what of Elspeth if the tide comes in on the wrong day." "1. Mer slides the second paper. The morning gift clause. The mill and its rent. A cow from every 3rd calf. The little house at the birch grove. If he dies before her, and leaves no bairn, the rights revert to her, and she may dwell there, untroubled by any man of ours or yours." 2. Emma's face does not move, but the room nudges a little closer to fair. "And the feud?" she asks, voice level as Pete. "Your cousin smashed my brother's mouth in the market with men watching. I am asked to salt that, and call it sweet." "Ling, a sithment," Mr says, the word like a coin set on wood. 2 steers. "Fat, this Michaelmas, and the hand that struck will carry your banner at the wedding and pour your first cup. In daylight, with witnesses. It is an apology set to choreography. It is humiliation calibrated to the ounce. The men glance at their boots because they know what it costs, and because they would never have thought of it. Fosterage, Miri says. "Final test. Will you send me your boy?" 1. Mer does not look at her son. "Aye. For 6 years." She slides the last slip across. The fosterage terms nurse. Tutor. Saint days. The right to return for funerals. And you'll take mine the same. Let them forget for a while, which fires birthed them. Dido. Emiri's thumb stops moving on the key. She turns to the window, where snow feather falls against the shutter. She is measuring not just the terms, but the weather for the next 3 winters, the tempers of men, the thirst of peat, the way hunger makes promises brittle. She turns back. "Done," she says. Then, with a needle's point of steel, "If your cousin flinches at the banner, the match is off, and the old songs are sung loud." Aminos. Mr inclines her head. He will not flinch. A boy somewhere in the house coughs. A dog stretches. The world continues. They stand, and because everything speaks, each offers the other, a small thing no one asked for. Miri unhooks a broocher, cheap one, but hers, and pins it on the paper roll. Mer calls for food to be sent to the riders who carried Mary's word through sleet. The big decisions are in ink and cattle. The glue is bread and respect. Deals like this were built in layers. A matron might add a clause about salmon, taken only on odd days, or about the right of sanctuary. If a kinsman fled into the bride's new hall, she might insist the handfasting a customary betrothal last a year and a day to prove both sides could behave. Or she could pull a match at the last instant with a word dropped at a wake. The boy drinks. Power did not require a shout. Often, it arrived as a sentence that sounded like advice. And when peacemaking failed, some women lit the fuse with intent. A withheld dowry item, a single promised milk cow delayed, a length of cloth dyed 1 shade too dull, could be read as contempt. A matron could refuse fosterage and send a spear instead of a son. At a wedding she disapproved. She might seat a minor rival too near the high board and let old quarrels breathe. These were not tantrums. They were targeted reminders that disrespect costs more than men believe. None of this moved without knowledge. A successful matron kept a weather eye not only on sky and pasture, but on gossip. She knew who had a sick child and would bargain cheap, which uncle's debts could be used to pry open a promise, which priest truly believed in mercy, and which believed only in being paid. She could listen to 3 conversations at once and harvest the only sentence that mattered. She could hold her face still while someone lied to her and save the truth for when it would buy more. So the Highlands endured on paper and peat, with songs and seals, because women treated marriages as treaties, children as guarantors, and feasts as folded maps. When men toasted the peace and told each other what they had won, they did so under roofs, held up by decisions women had made in daylight with a ledger, a conscience, and a patience that could outlast a winter. When the riders were away and the wind went strange, it fell to the woman at the longhouse door to turn a kitchen into a keep. Raids did not announce themselves with drums. They arrived as a shiver through cattle, as dogs gone silent, as a far-off clatter that might be thunder or iron, and then the choice: run the hill path and hope your legs outrun hooves or bar the door, count your breaths, and make the house a trap. Command began with voice and nerve. She did not waste either. Bars, she said, and hands found the oak beam that slid into the sockets. Benches upending now, meal chests, trestle, the great bed dragged sideways into the doorway. So the first man in would meet wood and not air. Powder dry, she told the boy by the hearth, and he moved the horn to the warmest stone but not too close. You wet the thatch. A girl ran for the water butt and hurled slopping buckets up a ladder so sparks had nothing to bite when fire came as persuasion. A pot already hanging over the banked peat fire was not emptied. It was fed. Oats and water thickened to a boil, a weapon in slow circles. If there was a turret or tower house to fall back to, she knew the ladder rungs by feel. But most Highland homes were byre dwellings, humans at one end, cattle at the other, and a byre can be a fortress. She swung the stall gates across the passage, so any intruder must fumble with wooden pins in the dark, while a muzzle and a dirk waited. She scattered ash and husks on the flagstones. The first boot that rushed would skate. In the smoke-blackened rafters, she hid a length of rope with a noose knotted on instinct. Improvisation is half of war. Weapons lived where work did. The beetling mallet for linen could cave a skull. The iron girdle for oatcakes could break a nose or brand a hand. The distaff was a short spear you did not see coming. If there was a firelock or two, a matchlock black as soot, or a newer flint, she laid them along the window slit and the stable vent. Not the door. Doors are for theatre. Windows are for work. She primed pans, tamped charges, rammed home ball, or scrap shot wrapped in rag, handed the gun to the steadiest elder while she set the next measure. Children tore strips from the one good sheet to twist into wads and bandages that would be blood in an hour if they were lucky. Outside, the warning travelled the old way. No courier with a seal, just noise. Pon beat against posts. A peat creel dropped twice from the loft ladder. A handbell snatched from the wall of the little oratory. Sound moves faster than feet over heather. Sound gathers neighbours with pitchforks and stakes. If the house sat within sight of a knoll stacked with gorse, a girl was already running to it with a brand. A single column of smoke by day, 2 at dusk, flame at night. Not poetry, but a code inside. She rehearsed the line. Do not shoot until you see the eyes. Powder is dear. Nerves misfire. She set the youngest beside her with a pail of water and another of lye from last wash day. The lye is caustic. An eye bathed in it forgets what it wanted to see. Near the stairhead, she placed the cauldron of porridge and a ladle with a long handle. Boiling gruel is not glamorous, but it clings and burns and teaches a man to let go of his ladder. Then the testing. A hand on the latch, a laugh that did not reach the eyes, voices calling names, claiming friendship. She answered nothing. To open the door is to invite truth to become a story you cannot control. Go to the window, she hissed to the boy, and he slid the little wooden shutter, a thumb's width, saw shadow, leather, a sliver of steel, slid it shut. Fear is an army of its own, and she conscripted it, hair loosed from braid, soot smeared across cheekbones and brow to hollow the eyes, whiting from the chest scattered over skin until she looked like a grave walker, a strip of red wool tied around the forehead for a splash of impossible colour. When she howled, it was not a human cry, but the long keening note of the Cao Iniad sharpened into a blade. Banshee, spirit, or simply a woman who understood that men who believe in omens fight badly. She taught the household to answer ululation, pot banging, the dog forced to bark by the girl who loved it least. Fear theatre works because belief lives in the spine and not the brain. Avinette, because this is best seen. Eliside has the matchlock braced on the sill and the ladle in her left hand. The window is no higher than her hip. The house was built for work, not archery. Below, a ladder scrapes stone. Fingers appear. Knuckles roar. She nods to Mrag, who hoists the cauldron's lip. Outside, a whisper becomes a hiss. Now, the first head lifts into the window frame, eyes pale as water. Elisade's face is dust white, with 2 streaks of soot down the forehead like tears. She screams, high and long. The man flinches just a breath, and the ladle tips. The porridge does what steel cannot. It sticks where it kisses. He drops, not like a warrior, but like a burned cook. The ladder teeters. The man beneath him swears in a language of pain. Eliside's thumb touches the match to the pan. The gun coughs like winter. A spark guttered. A flash. The second man folds as if his bones have remembered something urgent downstairs. Someone outside shouts, "Witch." The word is a gift. Let it spread. On the door, iron meets wood the first ram. Hold. Eliside says, and the bedstead shudders. Hold, she says again, and the word is a rope thrown across the room. Women pull to the command of a voice that does not shake. She turns to the old shepherd, with hands like roots. Your moment. He nods, slides his palm up the barrel of the second firelock, aims not at a face, but at legs. The thing that runs. He fires. Someone howls, as if the hill has stepped on him. Outside, a torch hisses against wet thatch, and fails. A second is tossed and dies. The girl on the ladder laughs too loud and tosses more water. When laughter carries, it enlarges a house. When they try the small byre door, it is not a door anymore, but a gate held by 2 stall bars and a pair of nails driven in hard an hour earlier by hands that had never driven nails so fast. The cow in the nearest stall huffs and kicks against the planking. A hoof is a weapon the law never taxes. A hand gropes through the gap. Mrag drops the beetling mallet with no ceremony and a lifetime's practice. Knuckles give. Men learn. Again, what women have always known. Bone is obedient to force. It does not last forever. Raids are brief by design. If they cannot take cattle in the first rush, raiders seldom linger to die for pride. They are not armies. They are hunger with edges. Yet the minutes between first ram and last footfall are years. In them, the house breathes together. In a rhythm she controls. You reload. You fetch bandages. You do not cry now. When a boy's hands shake so hard that the powder spills, she puts her palm over his like a lid on a jam jar and smiles as if nothing in the world will break again. Sometimes the theatre must go outside. If the men pause at the yard and mutter, still weighing whether the roof will flame or the door will fall, she what-ifs them to flight. A brand from the hearth held high, her hair ash-white with flour, she steps onto the threshold and becomes larger than her body shape witch. Death wife, saint, storm. It is not possession, it is politics. She tells them, in a voice a priest would not recognize, of the curse for those who break a woman's bond when her men are away, of the saint who turns blades in midair, of the child. Each of them loves by name, she guesses once, and hits twice, and the smallpox she can call down. Superstition is a lever. She pulls it with both hands. None of this is tidy. Sometimes they get in. Sometimes the house burns anyway. Sometimes she must choose to open the door, to show the infant at her breast and buy mercy with humility, to hand over the 2 best cows and say, "Go," and then watch men walk away with a part of the winter. Command is not a song of victories. It is a ledger of losses paid late. After, there is the other labor. She counts powder left, patches the door with a plank that does not match, rubs fat into the musket's lock and curses the damp. She sends a boy with the agreed-upon whistle call across the heather, 3 short, 1 long, to bring neighbours to help put the roof right. She scrubs porridge from the yard and from the wound in the old man's calf. She sits on the threshold as the light goes and hums a tune with no words. Because words have all been spent, she will sleep later, with the dirk beneath the pillow, and a dream in which the cattle do not run. Defend the hearth, the men say, as if the hearth were only a fire and not a frontier. But a woman knows different. A house is a law court, a hospital, a magazine, a bell tower, and a stage. You hold it with grain and water and heat and theatre, and the bravest thing of all, the decision to stand still when everything in you wants to run. In a land where parchment was rare and winters were long, remembering was a profession. The woman by the hearth knew the bloodlines the way a shepherd knows the sound of his own bellwether, by rhythm more than sight. She could spool out a genealogy while turning bannocks, each name bead-clicking into the next son of, daughter of, married to, sworn before witnesses, kin by milk if not by blood. That last clause mattered. A foster tie could stop a feud where oaths failed. Her voice traced the skein backwards through chiefs and crofters, through a cattle raid won because an uncle knew a ford, through a winter survived because a cousin sent oats when the ferry iced. Lineage in the Highlands was not an anthem, but a map you walk to stay alive. She carried that map into lullabies, not the syrup-sweet songs of nurseries, but working music soft enough for a child, sharp enough for an adult listening with half an ear to catch a warning folded inside. She would rock the baby and sing of Tormod, who kept his word, of Miri, who hid the key when men came, of the 2 brothers who broke over a heifer and knit again over a grave. The melody soothed, the story instructed, the refrain remembered. The words travelled farther than letters, around peat fires and down glens, into boats and bothies, until a child in another parish could hum a line and learn where not to step when he was grown. When someone died, and someone always did, her voice changed. The keening rose like wind up a corrie, a long tearing sound that made dogs whine and men stare into their hands. This was no private sobbing. The Chowanid was law and history in a single breath, naming virtues, naming wrongs, praising the dead, admonishing the living, and sometimes, if courage allowed, accusing. A lament could fix a deed in public memory so tightly that no chief could twist it free. Do not wrong the widow of Ruerid. The older women would say, in years after, her grief filled the kirk wall to wall. We heard the truth in it. Performance, yes, but justice. 2. Other performances healed bodies. The midwife came at a run when the pains began. A small woman with hands like warm water and a bag that smelled of dried plants and old linen. She knew the signs, the hitch in a breath that meant now, the grey tinge that meant too late, the way a baby's shoulder could catch and how to turn it without breaking bone. She had a string for tying the cord, and a knife she kept cleaner than anything else she owned. The string might be red, because red wards. The knife might have seen more births than feasts. She would warm oil at the fire goose if there was any, butter if not, and rub a belly until a storm unknotted. She had willow bark for the mother's afterward pain, bitter as honesty, and meadow sweet if she could get it, for the fever that sometimes comes 2 days later with teeth. The room became a theatre of small mercies, doors unbarred and windows cracked at the crucial hour to let luck in and bad air out science and superstition, shaking hands for once. An iron laid across the threshold so no wandering thing would step across. A sprig of rowan tied at the bedhead for the same reason. A bowl of water with a silver coin sinking like a moon at the bottom, because metal is pure or money persuasive. Choose the belief that helps you breathe. The midwife muttered, some words, prayer, some charm, none written down, She did not need Latin to be effective. She needed calm, heat, and time. When the child slid into her palms, she lifted him to the air, counted, breathed for him. If he would not, then laid him on his mother and locked the world outside for a minute. If it was a girl, the room softened in a different way, not less, just mixed with the mathematics of inheritance and the arithmetic of future alliances. She had thoughts about that, too, but saved them for tomorrow. Herbs lined the rafters like a soft armory, yarrow for bleeding, knapweed for wounds that would not close, plantain for the bite. Nobody saw. Nettle for iron in spring, juniper to smoke a sick room when you needed to clean by scent and symbol. There was comfrey knit bone, they called it, and she used it sparingly, because bones that knit too fast can trap wrong. There were ointments made in the right moon, because enough people had watched enough accidents to decide timing mattered. The wise woman distemmed, dried, steeped, boiled, and bottled while children watched and learned. Which leaves to avoid, and which to welcome. It was chemistry without a master's stamp, and theology without a pulpit, rooted in observation. This salve cooled, that one inflamed. This tea calmed a gut ravaged by winter oats. That one made an old man sleep too hard and not wake. Trust gathered around her like shawls. She was called to settle babies, to name rashes, to listen to chest sounds with an ear on a rib. She carried secrets. Who had miscarried thrice, whose husband drank, who needed a quiet remedy against a once-a-month terror. Folk paid with eggs, wool, gossip, respect. When she entered a doorway, people stood, not because she was grand, but because they wanted her to keep coming back. And yet, when cures failed, and cures always fail, because bodies are stubborn and predators patient, the trust that held her up could tilt and pour. A fever ran through cattle, and a child grew white and thin, and a second child after him. Snow fell too soon. The boat went down with the cousins in it. The laird wanted rents regardless. Someone needed to be the reason. And, when Providence refused to stand up and answer for himself, the community made a human shape for its pain. Who was there? They asked. Who touched the cow? Who muttered when the girl walked by? Who looked at the baby too long? The answers pointed toward the same woman who had warmed their hands and cooled their foreheads. The kirk sessions helped and hurt. The minister inveighed against superstition from a pulpit built by the very men who sent wives for rowan twigs. Then he listened to complaints in a back pew and wrote names in a neat hand he believed was God's work. Lairds who had no love for loose talk found it convenient to let fear run when dues ran late. A frightened village can be managed. A grieving one bargained with. Even neighbours who should have known better did not stand evenly on their memories. It is hard to hold both truths at once. She saved my sister, and my son died, so they fastened on the thing that felt like control. Tie her to a question. Avignette, to be fair to the terrible complexity. A child with a cough that sounds like old parchment. The healer sits the third night by the bed and boils water again, throws juniper on the peat, makes a tent of blankets to hold the steam. She has nothing left but hands. Tapping, rubbing, coaxing, singing. The mother prays. The father stares into the fire. The old grandmother looks through time with eyes that see both past and nothing. At dawn the child's chest quiets. Not the good quiet. Later, at the graveyard, a man says, "She took the fee and could not save him." Another man says nothing, remembering the day she pulled his wife back from a blood river. The first man's voice is louder. The minister's mouth is thin. A week passes. A cow's milk sours. Someone sees the healer gathering nettles by moonlight, because nettles are best then. Moonlight makes the story rounder. By Sabbath, there is a meeting. Communal trust is a fragile architecture. Scapegoating is the quick repair you grab when the roof leaks and you have no timber. You nail one life over the whole and tell yourself the winter will be kinder next time. Sometimes the community steps back from the brink. The grandmother stands, the midwife she trained stands beside her, and they lay out, name by name, the babies brought through, the wounds stanched, the men who would be dead without her, and sometimes it doesn't. You cannot always outrun the year's hunger or the laird's ledger with testimony. Then a woman whose hands have caught 50 children finds her wrists caught by rope instead, even where trials and pyres never come. Fear marks the edges. Charms are whispered more quietly. A sprig of rowan is tied under the table, not above it. The silver coin goes into the water out of sight. The healer keeps fewer records in her head and more in her eyes. She does not stop. She cannot. There is no one to replace her. But she trims her knowledge so it offends less, and the village trims its gratitude so it shows less. Between those careful cuts, life goes on, still. There are nights when the room is thick with breath and sweat, and the woman's hand sits on a labouring belly, and the child is not turning, and the mother is gone too far along to come back. Then all the suspicion in the glen could not keep that hand from doing exactly what it knows. The child slides, the mother sobs, the grandmother's laugh is a bark, the father cries in a way he won't admit tomorrow. After, the midwife sits on the threshold with her cup of thin ale, and looks at the mountain because mountains do not judge. She hums a line of an old lullaby with a genealogy tucked inside, and the line climbs the hill like smoke. It will go on without her. That is the point. The Highlands made historians of their women because paper burns and men travel. They made physicians of them because pain is local and help must be near. They made scapegoats of them when fear's teeth needed a neck. Between those roles, women built a quiet nation of memory and medicine that outlasted lairds and laws. You may not find their names in charters. You will find their work in every story that begins. My mother's mother said, and in every child who lived long enough to pass that sentence on. When the men carry him to the kirkyard and the spades fall quiet, the house does not stop. It turns on different hinges. The keys shift from his belt to hers with a clink that sounds louder than the psalms. In Highland law and habit both, a widow can be small in stature and large in consequence. Keeper of the gurnal, holder of the tack, the guardian of heirs, too young to sign their names. She has rights the terse, a liferent in a third of his lands, the jus relicti in his movable goods, the tocher she brought, and will not lose unless she is foolish enough to forget her own worth. But rights on paper mean little. If the world at the door thinks a woman's hand is soft, so she makes it iron. At dawn, she walks the yard with a plaid around her shoulders and time in her head, calves to be checked, a kiln to be fired, a sheaf of notes from tenants who paid in kind last Martinmas and promised silver at Lammers. She ties her hair tight, tucks a knife where it has always been tucked, and sits at the long table to hear petitions. Men who would have talked to her husband now talk to her. They do not quite know where to put their eyes. She helps them. Look at the ledger. We will keep accounts clean. She can count cattle backward in the rain. She can tell when a story is missing a Tuesday. She sends one boy to mend the dike, and another to fetch the factor who is late with a receipt. She does not raise her voice. She does not need to. The room takes its weather from her face. Power and peril arrive together. In-laws murmur about wardship if the eldest son is not yet of age. A neighbouring tacksman wonders aloud whether the grazing rights might be reconsidered in the new circumstances. The laird's agent rides up the track and talks of arrears as if grief were a purse he could reach into. She receives them in the doorway with bread and a stare. Hospitality is policy. Feed a man, and he will speak longer than he intends. Let him think himself comfortable, and he will show you where his weak joints are. Then, when the bread is finished, she puts the bond on the table and asks for a mark of his seal. If he will not give it, she will not give ground. Her husband is dead. His word is not. Some widows fight in the open. She gathers her husband's men older than boys, younger than legends, and says what must be said without ornament. They took him on the road. They thought the house would fold. Take only the cattle that bear their notch. Do not harm a man who stands down. Bring back what is ours. It is not war. It is arithmetic. The number of cows required to restore dignity, plus the number of witnesses required to make the story true. She pays them from her own store when they return. Boy proud and shaking with the after cold, She sends a measured letter for assignment, the blood price, written by the schoolmaster in a clear hand, and folds in a hair from her husband's combed old magic, walking side by side with new law. Other widows fight by quiet. She brews grief into leverage. She invites the rival to her table and sets out oat bannocks, a salted herring, and a jug of ale that tastes of peat and patience. The room is arranged with care, her sons to her right, the old men to her left, her daughter pouring ale with a steady wrist. She tells the story of the ambush once, plainly, without tremor. Then she is silent long enough that the air begins to creak. When she speaks again, she does not threaten. She reckons, "There are two paths," she says. "One is a winter of raids and bad sleep. The other is a bond of friendship and a marriage in spring. You choose and you sign, but you do not choose for us." She has already counted the cattle on both paths. He sees the count in her eyes. He chooses the bond not because he is moved, but because she has made it the cheap path. She does not blush to use her mourning like a banner. It is the only banner left that men will not cut down. There are widows who hold the estate entire through the long tutory years, writing with a steady hand, learning the factor's books until they can smell a false figure 2 pages away. There are widows who remarry to weld one fracture to another and make a stronger beam. There are widows who refuse the match offered and take the scandal, preferring clean poverty under their own name to comfortable obedience under someone else's. There are widows who move like shadows between rival fires, sending news in a loaf's crust. A ribon color, a misplaced blessing. All know the afterlight, the cool, bright steadiness that comes when you stop expecting the knock at the door to bring help and expect it to bring only news, a fragment, to show the workings. She stands at a low wall with the man who ordered the cut that took her husband. The wind has teeth. She is bareheaded by design. Grief should not look warm. "I cannot forgive," she says. "That is God's work, and he is slow. I can pay and be paid. That is ours." She names a number for cattle, a date for return, a marriage for a niece on her side to a cousin on his place, a pledge that neither party will shelter the other's outlaw for a year and a day. He stiffens at the marriage, softens at the outlaw clause, calls her dear lady, as if it were a stone he meant to throw, but decided against. She does not smile when he yields. She only repeats the numbers so they sit properly in the air. Later, at home, she sits on the threshold and lets herself shake. That is private. The ledger is public. But this is not only a story of narrow glens and old law. The afterlight stretches forward into the age when empire comes down the roads in boots and paper. Statutes and proclamations begin to do what swords could not. Strip jurisdiction from chiefs. Outlaw the wearing of tartan in public. Break the clan courts. Disarm the hills. Rename authority until it forgets its own sound. Factors replace kin. Surveys replace songs. And yet, the women's work does not end. It dives under. When tartan is prescribed, a woman cuts a hidden facing for a child's coat from an old plaid and teaches him not to turn his cuffs out in town. When Gaelic is discouraged in schools, she turns lessons into walking songs. The work of fulling cloth, beating time into vocabulary so the girls can hold the language in their hands as well as their mouths. She stores the seed oats in a chest beneath her bed and hides the key in the hem of her skirt, because men who will tear a house apart, looking for contraband, will not lay hands on a widow's clothing. She memorizes the rents when the factor takes the books away and repeats them at night until numbers run like prayer. She hosts the travelling priest at midnight in the dairy and the minister's wife in daylight in the parlour, because both have their place in keeping neighbours from harm. She sends a son to the Indies and a daughter to Nova Scotia, and packs for each the same inheritance, a slip of rowan, a spoon, a lullaby with genealogy stitched into the chorus. The clearances take roofs, and kin, they do not take the tune. That goes in the mouth, where no factor can seize it. In this afterlight, the widow's victories cannot be counted in charters or stones. They are measured in continuities. A field still sown, though the name on the writ has changed. A proverb in the right place that shuts a fool up without a quarrel. A girl who knows which ridge shelters lambs from an east wind because her mother made her stand there in sleet until she could feel it. A son who can bargain with a lowland factor without apology because his mother taught him the numbers under his own roof. The triumphs are small because the stage has been made small on purpose. Empire likes a big audience and a single tongue. She answers with kitchens, back rooms, and plural speech. In the ledger of monuments, Highland widows are poor. In the ledger of survival, they are very rich. They did not always steer the clan away from ruin. Sometimes they steered it through. They did not always stop blood. Sometimes they made it useful. They did not always save a house. Sometimes they taught a house how to move and remain itself. Their statues stand nowhere, yet everywhere a story begins. When your great-gran was left with 5 and a winter coming, the afterlight they lit is not splendor, it is steadiness. It burns in hidden seams, a hem of tartan, a tune at the washtub, a contract spoken before witnesses with no ink at all. The suppression that tried to flatten them into silence only pressed the pattern deeper. Turn the cloth over in your hands, and you can still feel it, the raised weave where women drew their power not toward the horizon, but down into the ground, so the next step, and the next, would land on something that held. Step inside a Renaissance court, and the air speaks before anyone does roast pheasant and cinnamon, orange blossom and wax, the faint breath of rosewater shaken from sleeves. Tapestries hold their breath along the walls, gold thread catching torchlight, silver weights in ranks, and the goblets, Sicilian sweet wine, sweating at the lip glow like small suns. This is not dinner, this is declaration. In Florence, Ferrara, Milan, the ruling houses Medici, Este, Sforza turned the act of eating into a grammar of power. Every chair has a tense, every plate, a verb, every glance, a clause that can elevate or erase. The hall itself is a stage set whose furniture knows its lines. You don't need a herald to translate it. You can read the room if you know the map. Draw it with your eye. The long axis runs from the great door where velvet and rumour flow in, to the dais, a raised platform beneath a baldachin glittering with family devices. Here sits the host, the chair of estate carved like a genealogy, its canopy, the visible roof of his authority. To his right, the place of highest honour. To his left, the second. That right-hand seat is worth a treaty all by itself. The high table runs along the short wall with the host at its centre. Below it, trestles spill down the room in decreasing importance, like tributaries losing force the farther you sit from the axis, the thinner your voice becomes. Along the south wall, a multi-tiered credenza displays, plate in ascending order salvers, flagons, is more treasury than sideboard. The glitter is not clutter. It's an argument. We can afford to let our silver be furniture. Opposite, a minstrel's gallery watches from above. But sometimes music works the flank, a consort at floor level, like a current guiding conversation. Note the door to the kitchens, draughty, busy, scented with steam and command. Seats near it are exile placed, where your words are constantly interrupted by servants' traffic and the hiss of saucepans. Note too the humbler door that leads to the passage and the privies. If your bench backs onto that corridor, someone in power wants you to smell your position. The centre line from host to door is the bright road of favour. Beyond it, the shadows lengthen. Within this map, everything is tactical. Sit too far down the long tables, and you have been relegated from council to chorus. Sit close enough to count the seed pearls on the host's doublet, and you are drafted into intimacy and obligation. If your chair faces the room, you display yourself. If you are turned slightly sideways, you are meant to watch. Even the angle of a stool can push or pull a man toward alliance. And the furniture performs. A chair with arms grants you the right to lean. A backless bench tells you to keep your posture, your caution, and your opinions sharply upright. The table itself murmurs rank. At the high board, damask as pale as a winter sky. Farther down, linen of stout weave. Near the service door, bare wood that leaves splinters. If a guest forgets himself and grips, The rules of consumption bite as sharply as the cloves in the wine. A toast is never only a blessing. Raise a goblet and say, "To the peace that endures," and everyone in the room feels the little blade tucked inside the words. If a man who broke a truce last month drinks to peace tonight, he puts his throat under public review. If the host adds, "May it be as long as our friendship with Naples," he has just set the clock on an alliance. This vintage is about to age out. The wrong compliment can insult a cousin by praising a rival cook's sauce. The wrong swallow can brand you greedy. Provincial, ungoverned. Men are weighed by appetite, women by restraint. A lady who can eat citrus with a knife and not stain her sleeve is rehearsing authority down to the wrist. Service enters like choreography. Pages in livery move, as if pulled by music. Eyes lowered for them. Silence is uniform. Dishes travel along prescribed routes, always past the credenza first, as if to bow to wealth, then up the line of the long tables before they approach the high board. You may watch a pie cross the room and learn your fortune by the way it slows or smooths its passage, whether a server turns its crest toward you or keeps the lion rampant facing the host. A platter shaped like a hippocamp mythic. Marine bears fish, for a diplomatic purpose, to suggest Venice's favour, to flatter a Genoese envoy, to warn a rival that the sea, too, is allied. You don't eat it first, you read it first, and then the interludes, the entremets, arrive as arguments disguised as marvels. A pastry castle that opens to let live birds fly is not a whim. It is a boast of control. We command surprise, and we release it on schedule. A tray borne by boys dressed as Zephyr's blue gauze. Gold dust. Little curls stiff with honey says, "We hire beauty and make it carry things." Fireworks between courses, sparks hissing against the stucco ceiling brag about gunpowder procurement as much as entertain. If the host wishes to needle a neighbour, a troupe of dancers might enact, as myth, a story whose ending everyone recognises. A proud stag, humbled by a hunter from the west. The stag wears the other man's colours. No one names him. Everyone laughs. Underneath the sugar and music, food sits in rank and file, speaking the language of distance and money. Saffron in the broth says the spice roots bow to this table. A clove is a small, dark coin from an island, a continent away. The host spends it on your tongue to tell you he can. Citrus slices perched like moons on a salad whisper of southern orchards and fast couriers. A plate of sea bream arrives fresh at a hill town. Court proof that ice, mules, and human nerve can outrun heat. It isn't just flavour, it's feasibility as theatre. The hall registers everything too much wine at your elbow, and the musicians lean on a minor chord in the next piece. A bitter look at a seating assignment, and the steward notes it, then, accidentally, reroutes a less generous dish to your section. The head carver, his sleeves tied back like a surgeon, disassembles a peacock with elegance, reassembling it in its skin, and the way he presents the first slice signals court weather. To the papal nuncio, if the host wants Rome's ear. To a local noble, if the host wants the room to know who is loved today. When the sugar sculptures comelians, laureled emperors, a griffin devouring a boar. They do not just make the children's eyes open, they fix the evening's allegory into digestible matter. Breaking them is both dessert and decision. Etiquette reads like law. You do not speak across rank. You relay words up or down the table like a lit fuse. You do not interrupt a toast unless your blood is thick enough to pay the consequences. You do not glance too long at the credenza's top tier. Those ewers and basin sets are not for washing. They are for witnessing. You do not, if you are wise, underestimate the women at the high board. Their forks move delicately. Their eyes move like scouts. A nod passed between a duchess and a marquesa can draft a son's future while the men argue over boar's head and canon law. The meal is an army of little intentions marching in formation. Some nights, the table is a bridge. A marriage to be announced tomorrow tastes tonight like candied quince, pomegranate, and saffron fertility and cost spooned into one mouthful, sweetness that asks for patience. Some nights, the table is a field of punishment. Arrival placed 3 seats from the kitchen. His ewer of wine refilled at a pace just too slow, his plate a little colder every time. He eats and understands. He drinks and understands more. He touches his napkin to his lips and knows he has been abraded before witnesses. Watch the furniture, and you will see it acting. The dressoir's tiers of plate decrease over the evening as if fealty were being poured out. But notice, the bottom shelves empty first. The top remains untouched, unless the host wants to suggest extravagance without bankruptcy. The dais creaks once, that theatrical note of elevation, even the salt the large. Sculptural salt cellar near the high board draws a boundary. Sit above the salt. You belong below the salt. You serve. When the steward finally signals the lève de table, the clearing itself is a show. The sudden hush as knives are lifted and counted, the soft thunder of removed boards, the long line of servers carrying away evidence as cleanly as a well-kept secret. What does the hall ask of you? To eat like a citizen and listen like a spy. To read the chairs as if they were charters, the courses as if they were dispatches. To understand that a toast can bind more tightly than a seal, and a seat can cut as surely as a writ. The banquet is not merely fuel. It is a language that can be spoken fluently or badly, with grace or with a mouthful. If you leave full and favoured, it will be because you translated correctly, and were translated, in turn, into someone the room wanted to keep close to the axis. Walk back through the great door with cinnamon in your hair and the map in your head. You will have learned the city without once stepping into its streets. Tonight, politics were plated, alliance pour, and borders drawn with knives that never left the table. The hall will be swept. The silver will be counted. The tapestries will go on listening. Tomorrow, the same room will speak again, with the same furniture and a different grammar. The table talks as long as power eats. Begin with the menu, because in Italy the menu is a map. It doesn't simply list what you'll eat. It arranges how your body, your status, and your host's message will be managed. The first dishes are openers, gentle and cleansing. Candied citron strips, a pale almond broth, a salad bright with bitter greens and orange. According to humoral medicine, the stomach must be coaxed, awake light, cool, and moist, so the body's inner weather won't revolt. Then warmth creeps in, a capon broth scented with ginger, a thin rice with almond milk, steam rising, like a physician's reassurance. Only when the furnace is primed do the triumphs arrive. Roasts lacquered with spice, sauces dark as oaths, capers snapping like punctuation. Toward the end, sweetness returns to seal the bargain between appetite and order. Quinze past, pears in malmsey, comfits that crackle sugar over anise and coriander. Last comes the void, the formal emptiness after fullness. Hippocras is spiced, wine poured as a digestive. The evening's last argument set to clove and cinnamon. Sequence isn't courtesy, it's doctrine. Hot follows cold, dry follows moist. Dense meats are preceded by things that open the passages. If you break the order, you break the guest. A clever host keeps physicians nodding and courtiers purring by making health feel like luxury. So the almond soup does double duty. It flatters the Islamic and Jewish palates in a cosmopolitan court, and also cools an overheated complexion. The rice is exotic enough to impress and bland enough to soothe, and every stage whispers, "We have thought of you from inside your body outward." That is the most flattering flattery there is. Spice tells a parallel story geography shaved into powder. Black pepper, ordinary today, was once bookkeeping with a fragrance, counted by the sack, levied as rent, stored like coin. Cloves and nutmeg came from islands most diners could not imagine. Little green beads on the edge of the world that had to cross monsoons. Caravans, middlemen, wars, and Venetian ledgers, before they could dissolve on a Milanese tongue. A single clove in a sauce for vel, say, was a small detonation of money. Cinnamon wrote a different line. Less heat, more perfume. A hint of desert commerce and Mamluk ports. Then later, a Portuguese sea route swagger that let a host hint, delicately, that his contacts outran his neighbours. You could taste politics. You could taste ships. Sugar is the loudest luxury, not a sprinkle, but a structure. To turn cane into crystals takes a chain of labor that starts under an empire sun and ends under a Florentine chandelier. When sugar appears, it does so on purpose, as a glaze that turns a roast peacock into lacquered myth, as a marzipan garden whose almond perfume says, "We control orchards you will never see," as a white dust on candied pine nuts that makes winter sparkle indoors. Honey is local, sugar is global. Choosing one or the other is a sentence in the evening's grammar. And then there's the fish, that favorite inland flex. If you can serve sea bream in a hill town without shame, you have outmaneuvered heat and distance. Couriers ride through the night. Snow from mountain caves hoarded in straw-lined pits buys the fish a few more hours of life. Eels travel in barrels, muslik and beligand, or packed in damp moss that smells of riverbank. Oysters arrive closed like sealed letters and are opened with knives that know both violence and etiquette. On fast days, fish is piety. On feast days, it is logistics in sauce. To bring the sea to a city that can't hear waves is to own more than kitchens you own paths. Edible allegory sits everywhere, if you know how to read it. A pomegranate split across a plate sends a quiet shock of red seeds' fertility. Multitude. Promises, especially effective on the eve of announcing a marriage. Figs stand for wisdom and also for satiety. Offer them late, and you suggest the room should be full of sense and enough. A pie shaped like a lion is not a whimsy. It's a sentence about strength and jurisdiction. Add gilded claws of pastry, and the message sharpens. The host's justice is beautiful, and it bites. Swans, redressed in their own feathers after roasting, glide in on silver and say nobility outlives the fire. A boar's head, clove-studded and apple-mouthed, roars old Roman gravitas into the Renaissance room. Even colour codes: saffron gold for prosperity, parsley green for renewal, blueberry dark sauces for secrecy supply adjectives to the meal's nouns. Economics hum beneath the tablecloth like a second consort. The price of pepper rises with storms in the Indian Ocean. The grace of your sauce thins with it. A duke whose ships beat a Levantine convoy to port can pour cinnamon like rain. A rival whose factors arrived late will hint at restraint and serve genius instead. Rosemary. Bay. Garlic local flavors that argue for virtue over wealth without admitting to the shortage that inspired them. The menu is a market report sung in the key of appetite. The kitchens follow commodity news as closely as the chancery follows troop movements. Course logic also organizes hierarchy. The triumph disher centerpiece designed to halt talk rarely appears without a heralding pageant. When the pastry fortress rolls in, its sugar pennants snapping, no one speaks. They watch for the story hidden inside. Perhaps a section lifts to reveal two suckling pigs painted as rival cities, each wearing sugared laurel. Perhaps a marzipan Europa rides a candied bull around the platter, and everyone pretends not to notice the envoy from the place currently being courted. Eat your myth, the host implies, and digest the message too. When the sculpture is finally smashed and distributed, guests carry the allegory away in their sleeves. Sticky with meaning. Not all symbolism shouts. Sometimes it blinks. The number of courses can be an omen odd numbers for elegance and the suggestion of continuation. Even numbers for closure. Heaviness, a hint that something is ending. The order inside a course can praise or punish. Serving trout before pike is a courtesy to a guest known to prefer delicacy over force. Reversing it can test a palate as publicly as a duel tests nerve. The carving sequence, who receives the first slice of venison, whose plate warms longest near the hearth, can declare an heir without naming him. The semiotics of fruit do quick. Elegant work. A dish of sliced quince, tough fruit, made tender by time honors patience. Candied, bitter orange, offers love that keeps its bite. Grapes say, autumn bounty, but raisins say prudence stored for winter. Almonds whisper, prosperity and fecundity both. Pine nuts, dear little torches of forests far away, to announce that supply lines are healthy. If you see dates, you are being asked to think of caravans, and by extension, the hosts reach into sands beyond maps. All of it rests on labor you never see. The kitchen is an orchestra pit beneath the stage, beating time. Scullions turn spit with blistered hands, so the capon's skin will make that exquisite crackle under cinnamon. Apprentices lean over mortars until their shoulders ache, pounding almonds and sugar into paste that keeps its shape when it matters. A boy fetches snow from the ice pit by torchlight, so the sorbet holds for the walk across the courtyard. The steward counts cloves like coins, then approves one more for the hypocrite. Because the papal visitor smiled at the host's last line, logistics become taste. Taste becomes power. Power becomes memory. By the time the void course arrives, little comfits, candied fennel seeds, bright as confetti, crystallized violets that break like stained glass. You will have been fed more than food. You will have swallowed a map of trade winds and politics, a primer on medicine disguised as kindness, and a small library of symbols that will follow you into your dreams. Tomorrow, you may not recall the exact shade of the swan's glaze, but you will remember the lion pie's stare. You will remember the pomegranate bursting like a future. You will remember that somewhere, out beyond the hall, men and money crossed oceans. So you could feel cinnamon in your throat and think of empire. Leave the table, and the story lingers on your tongue. Hot, then sweet, then a little bitter at the edges. The taste of a world that eats the world and calls it hospitality. In a Renaissance cour, the most dangerous man after the Duke might be the one holding a ladle. He knows how long it takes for a rumour to travel from the scullery to the high table. He knows which envoy eats slowly when he lies, which bishop fasts, except for eel. He decides whether the night tastes of cinnamon triumph or of rosemary thrift. And he can make a hall fall silent with a gesture to the door. The court calls him cook, but he is engineer, choreographer, quartermaster, perfumer, sculptor, and, when needed, pyrotechnician. He plots a dinner like a campaign, not just to satisfy hunger, but to move opinion, to stage reconciliation, to salt humiliation, until it gleams. His kingdom is not the hall, but the furnace below it. A battery of hearths and brick ovens, spits that turn like planets, braziers that hold a fickle glow. The air is hot enough to bake a thought. A steward's scalco reads the evening like a ledger. Guests, enmities, frailties. Rank, the trinciante, master carver, hones, knives, to whisper thinness into roast capon. Boys paddle creams in copper, their arms sharking through the heat. And a sugarman, the confeitier, tends a cauldron that climbs from pearl to thread to ball and crack, judging with a drop into cold water, with a finger and a prayer, because a half-second decides whether a triumph stands or slumps. Runners learn the palace by pulse. 2 courts, a windy arcade, a blind corner near the chapel. They carry not just dishes but temperature, texture, timing. Send too soon and the peacock weeps grease. Send too late and the sauce tightens like a fist. The chef has mapped the route from fire to mouth. He has counted steps, measured drafts, listened to doors. A sideboard, the credenza, waits like a customs house. Tasters test for poison. A final glaze shivers across a roast. The last leaves of marjoram fall as delicate as counsel. Heat is rationed like gold. One hearth roars for pastry, another broods for sugar, a third breathes steady for the confit that will carry the duck from afternoon to midnight. In a corner stands the snow chest, straw-lined and precious, a small winter hidden in July. The chef guards it, the way a general guards bridges. But logistics are only the bones. He writes in flavour. He knows which guests need the flattery of saffron, which can be impressed with discipline alone. 6 perfect turnips, roasted in ashes, their sweetness. A sermon on virtue. He can make thrift sing so loudly, no one hears the missing clove. Or he can pour spice-like coin to say, "We traffic where you only dream." He composes an argument course by course, humoral comfort to open the gates, then fanfare, then allegory, then hush. The hush he values that most, a room full of power that forgets to speak, is a room that has yielded, if only for 15 seconds. And in 15 seconds a host can plant a thought that will bloom by dawn. For the hush, you need spectacle. Enter the sugar. Sugar is empire, rendered edible. Canecutandera colonial sun, boiled down with labor, you will never see. Refined and sold and shipped until it arrives at court, not as sweetness but as possibility. In the confetier's hands, it becomes paste and marble, glass and glue. He casts columns, lattices, and balustrades. He coaxes feathers and fur. He raises minarets and triumphal arches from powder and patience. He perfumes the mass with ambergris or rosewater until scent, sight, and appetite are indistinguishable. He stages a trionfo di zucchero that is less centerpiece than thesis. A marzipan orchard each fig blushed, each leaf veined where a stag of moulded paste leaps a sugar stream, a fortress with candy ramparts that can be breached by a spoon, a Roman forum reduced to a platter, complete with senators in almond robes and a palm-sized victory, goddess balanced on one sugared foot. Guests learn to read before they eat. They count the lions and guest jurisdictions. They find the pomegranate split along the bride's place and murmur about heirs. They note that the Griffin House badge of arrival arrives. Yes, but arrives asleep. A confect cannon fires, drags, and someone laughs. Then stops, because the jest carries a message. One bite ends interpretation. You cannot decode what you have devoured, and yet that is the game. Disarm the symbol with the teeth. The cook arranges this theology of appetite and power with the confidence of a man who knows that even marble statues someday fall, but sugar statues must fall now on cue to close the scene. He has collaborators. Of course, sculptors lend molds. Goldsmiths advise on proportion. Tailors consult on drape so that a sugared banner can wave without breaking. Musicians receive the cue to swell. As the doors open, the triumph dish must cross the threshold in the crest of sound. Not before, and not after. Pages rehearse the path, lifting the gilded board as one. A captain of servants places the host's knife at exactly the angle the painter recommended for tomorrow's tapestry. In the gallery above, a court poet jots a couplet that will taste of cinnamon when performed between courses. The kitchen is an orchestra pit. The chef beats time with ladles. All of this is power, but the chef also hoards a different currency, knowledge. In 1570, Bartolomeo Scappi publishes his opera in 6 thick books, more than 1,000 recipes. Yes, but also diagrams of ovens and spits, schematics for portable stoves and ice wells, carving charts, lenten menus, fast day stratagems, and the theatre of service, from pantry to plate. It is a cookbook and a blueprint, an advertisement to patrons, and a barricade against rivals. An argument that the chef is not a servant, but an intellect. Scappi had cooked for cardinals and the papal court. In print he cooks for posterity. A duke can hire a palate. An empire hires a mind. After Scappi, every ambitious cook studies and imitates. The kitchen becomes a place not just of heat, but of ideas. Ratios that behave. Sauces that remember how to shine. Order that can be taught. If a prince can put his arms on a page, so can a cook. If a prince can found a library, so can a kitchen. Celebrity follows. Courts compete for names, sending velvet letters and heavier purses. A great cook's arrival can lift a city's mood. Merchants feel it in the spice market. Fishermen feel it in the night price of eels. The chef carries patrons with him like constellations, formerly of Ferrara, late of Mantua, summoned to Rome. He is greeted with discreet thunder, and he renegotiates the contract with a smile. Guaranteed access to citrus when winter comes. The right to choose his own carvers. A promise that no chamberlain will interfere in the order of service. He is polite, because he can afford to be. His smallest signature a particular glaze. A fondness for quince boiled the precise length of the credo becomes recognizable enough to be quoted. to be parodied, to be stolen. He also watches the margins, because dinner can fail at the edges. Sugar sweats in humid weather. He stations braziers and fans to nurse it through. Wind funnels down a stair. He changes the procession so the sauce arrives covered, then is unveiled like a secret. A favorite peacock bows under its own weight. He guts and stuffs with a lighter meat and bastes with syrup until the skin tightens to lacquer. He retools on the fly, and no one outside the kitchen ever knows. It looks like magic. It is rehearsal. At table, the performance lands. The pie arrives a lion in pastry relief, mane combed with a fork, claws picked in clove. The room lifts its head like a single animal. The trinciante carves. The chef stands unseen, listening to the silence that follows the first bite. It is the silence he planned for, the silence he bought with snow and sugar, with maps and buoys and burnt fingertips. Inside that silence, the host who understands theatre, if he understands anything, can tilt a treaty, soften a verdict, float a name. The dish dissolves. The decision holds when the last comfit clicks against the last tooth and the hypocrite warms the last throat. The hall begins to talk again, looser, pleased with itself. The chef has already sent the triumph back to be dismantled, its broken battlement shards redistributed like relics. In the heat below, the sugar man sets his cauldron to soak and counts his burns. The steward, totting figures in a wax tablet, thinks, just for a moment, of how much a single clove cost to make that widowed ambassador forget his grief. And in a room off the kitchen, the chef sits with a quill and updates a notebook. One more ratio, one more route through the galleries, one more way to make a room submit without noticing. Upstairs, they will say the Duchess wore pearls like frost, and that the musicians found a new tenderness for the Neapolitan air. They will not say the evening hinged on a glaze catching light for exactly the span of a breath. They will not say that a sugar lion taught a lesson and was eaten for it. They will leave the hall convinced they have tasted power. They have just not the person they think it belongs to. Sugar will go scarce next winter. Pepper will spike when storms batter the Levant. The chef will adjust, and the hall will never know it. The empire of flavor is not on maps. It lives in a heat that never sits still, in a cauldron that boils to a different mathematics, in a book that declares the kitchen an academy. Tomorrow, another triumph will cross another threshold, and the same hush will fall, timely as a tide. That is the craft, to build a world that melts in the mouth, and still leaves a monument behind. A court banquet could crown reputations or shear them to the scalp, and no one knew that calculus better than the women seated in silk, near the salt. Men thundered with toasts and treaties. Women worked in the interval, the quiet between clink and swallow, where a glance could reroute a convoy and a smile could cauterize an insult. The hall read them as ornament. They read the hall as text. Start at the threshold. A lady enters with measured lateness, neither eager nor aloof, her train lifted by pages who have been drilled not to step on the embroidery that names her. Pearls mark lineage. A sprig of rosemary threaded into a sleeve marks loyalty if you can see it. A narrow bracelet of jet says mourning without forcing a conversation. She owns her chair, by the way. She occupies the air around it. The knife lies near her plate, because the trinciante will carve, but she could cut if she had to. She removes one glove, not two, because touch is permission, and she gives it sparingly. Even her hunger is curated. Castiglione called it sprezzatura, effort that looks like air, yet its cost is a ledger in the mind. How many bites before a rival calls you greedy? How little eaten before a physician murmurs about humours and whispers drift to barrenness? Etiquette is not obedience. It is bearing as bulwark. Soft power begins with the softest act, tasting. A woman lifts the spoon as though receiving a secret. She tastes for politics saffron thick enough to declare trade routes secure, pepper generous enough to suggest a duke has paid his debts to a Levantine factor, the sugar. So lavish it almost glows, promising the treasury is not empty. A thin broth can be a warning. The room will decide whether it tastes virtue or shortage. She decides which story to tell with her second sip. She is not fed. She curates. In some houses, she has chosen the menu itself. Lenten restraint on a day that needs humility, or a run of river fish served inland to advertise reach. She does not cook. She commissions. The confeitier has shown her a sugar theatre of a phoenix rearing from cinnamon ash, and she has said, "Not tonight. Save resurrection for the treaty signing." Instead, she points at a marzipan garden full of bee-laden blossoms. The message is abundance of labour, not miracles. She knows that an orange studded with cloves at a widow's place can read as comfort or as reminder the scent of the husband's last winter. She can slope a conversation with a platter. The table is a map. The host's axis is power. Exile seats run to the cold corners. A lady notes who is placed uphill of whom. She notices that the Neapolitan envoy sits where the musicians will drown him deliberate because he was too clever yesterday. She pads the insult with a comment about how splendidly his coast yields lemons, even in unfriendly winds, and by the time his smile returns, the insult has done its work but not its damage. She is a shock absorber with pearls. Interludes cascade between courses. A masked moresca clatters through the hall, swords ringing apiece. The dancers have no intention of keeping. A boy in mercury wings balances on a sugar cloud to recite a verse about empire that names no one but implicates all. Then the pie. Servants bear it in like a reliquary. The crust bulges, breathes. Cracks live birds burst out in a clatter of feathers and light. Bright panics. Some guests yelp. Some laugh. All look up. The lady does not flinch. She turns to the man she needs and says lightly, "Where there is music beneath the crust, one ought not judge by the lid," making a joke about pastry and about rumour in the same breath. He hears it. That is networking at volume 3 on a scale that runs to 10. A woman's network is not a club. It is a circulatory system. Cousins at other courts, a nurse who married a clerk, a lady in waiting who hears the master of horse talk in his sleep, a merchant's wife who understands which crates came ashore empty of tax. They exchange with discretion, a recipe that flatters as it informs, a ribbon dyed in a shade that has not yet reached this city, a visiting poet's line copied onto a card, folded into a glove. A noble woman's repertoire includes coded compliments that work like keys. Your lace is so fine, even spiders would envy. It carries a small sting for a rival whose husband trades in coarser thread. That broth is a marvel of restraint. Consoles a host whose pantry she knows is strained. When slights are clumsier, the blade is cleaner. Avignet, Mantua, winter. The hall smells of quince and smoke. A Venetian envoy, all satin and salt, lifts his cup and says, almost to himself, "How charming that inland kitchens attempt sea flavours." He means, "Your court copies ours." The lady of the house smiles, as if she has heard a blessing. She dabs her lip, sets down her cup, and murmurs just loud enough for the next rank of listeners to lean. We attempt little. We cannot perfect. Tonight we serve river fish, kept swift as truth in snow carried from the Alps before midnight. But if the lagoon ever learns our method, send word. We will protect your ice convoys. The table shivers with laughter, the soft kind that won't draw blood, and the envoy nods as if he had meant to ask for protection all along. An insult has been converted into leverage, and a logistical promise, escort for ice, and, beneath it, for information. Performance continues above the plates. Fans speak in small weather. Sleeves carry private signals. A napkin dropped is a signal, if it is the first. An accident if it is the third. Between courses, the hostess may direct a brief dialogue in which masked goddesses counsel prudence. It is addressed to everyone, and to the one man who needs to feel advised without feeling corrected. She commissions that allegory because she understands rage can be redirected more elegantly than refused. Live birds may fly. Tameness is for tempers. Grace is also defense. A stain can be used against you for a decade. A cough can be read as weakness if repeated thrice. She manages her body as a shield. Small bites, No cheeses that cling to the teeth, no laughter that bears them too long. Wine is sipped then veiled by water. Staying sober is survival. When the toasts become spurs, she interposes a story, a little one. How the snow chest was lined with straw from a saint's field. Nothing to do with anything, everything to do with lowering a temperature. She lets others look mighty. She chooses to be necessary. Sometimes she directs the entertainment's vector. If the household must reconcile two enemies who will not toast each other, the dessert theatre can force their hands. Out rolls a sugar bridge too narrow for two. It stops at their places, a span of almond paste and threat. The poet announces a game. Each lord must break one end and meet in the middle, or be accused merrily. Oh, merrily of fearing ants. A murmur rises. The room leans in. Pride cannot bear to refuse under a chorus of laughter. They snap the bridge, bite the middle, and the hall cheers at two men chewing their enmity. She has paid in sugar for a small piece. The ledger balances. Coded speech travels the table like a tide. A lady knows how to sink a rumour without seeming to. She does not contradict. She adds detail until the lie becomes too heavy to float. Yes, yes, I heard his ship filled with wool coarser than usual. Poor lambs. And the captain is new to that river, which has a way of discouraging the inexperienced. We shall pray for the sandbanks. No one will repeat a story dressed in that much specificity unless they are willing to own it. By midnight, the rumour has drowned, nor does she pretend the theatre stops at the doors. She walks the galleries afterward, the long cooling corridors, where ambassadors drop the last of their guard. The Duchess thanks the confiteor by name within earshot of a factor who handles sugar accounts, and that factor will go to bed believing himself seen. She remarks on a dish near the steward, who fought to budget it. She lets the chef know through the carver, always through the carver, that the phoenix should be held for the spring equinox, and that the widow will need an orange, clothed with restraint. On Sunday, she stitches gratitude like a seam, binding kitchen to hall so tight that prying fingers later will snag. By the time the candles gutter, deals have softened, suspicions have grown a crust. Men leave convinced that wit and wine did the work. The women carry the ledger of what truly changed. Which quarrel thawed, which pledge hardened, who watched whom instead of the sugar theatre, which envoy laughed at the wrong time, and showed the crack in his brief. Grace has held all night, an armour that looks like light. If it has done its job, no one will see the dent until daylight, when a promise made over pomegranate seeds arrives in writing, and a convoy of ice moves under escort along a road. No one thought safe yesterday. The dishes are cold now, the sugar lion's mane broken into souvenirs, tucked into sleeves. A lady pockets one curl, not for sweetness, but for memory, proof that the evening's allegory existed and did its work. Tomorrow someone will say the banquet was merely beautiful. She will smile, as if beauty were all she brought to a table that talks. She knows better. She leaves the hall the way she entered. Measured lateness, train lifted, rosemary still green. The room exhales without her. It does not realize that its best agreements were signed in the space she made around a goblet, with a compliment that drew blood so softly it felt like silk. Begin with hoofbeats in the dark, and a map that won't hold still. On the northern grasslands, the Jiangnü ride in loose clouds, splitting and reforming like weather, arrows flying from saddles that scarcely slow. Villages on China's edge are not defended by legions, so much as by time, by how long it takes a distant magistrate to hear the alarm, to send a courier, to ruse troops, to arrive after the barns are ash. Qin Shihuang, who has just hammered warring states into a single empire, hates problems that begin with if and when. He prefers solutions you can walk along, so he orders a line, not a new invention, Zhao and Yan and Qin, before Qin all built their own scrappy north walls, but a new idea about scale and purpose. Link the fragments, bend them to one strategy. Where an old wall runs the wrong way, tear it down and drive a new course across ridge and ravine, so the frontier reads as a sentence, not a stutter. He has standardized script, coin, axle widths. Now he standardizes fear. In the West, stone is scarce, and speed is king. So they build with earth, and the word rammed ceases to be metaphor. Wooden formwork goes up like a giant's comb. Crews pour in layers of soil mixed with gravel, reeds, struff, and tamp each stratum until the wall is not pile but plank, the hardest fired brick in the desert air. In the mountains, where rock is plentiful and the climbs are murderous, they drag quarried blocks on sleds over paths that would make goats swear oaths. Watch where the line runs. It hugs ridge, crests the backs of sleeping dragons. Later poets say, because a wall on a skyline needs no height to be tall, the cost is counted in shoulders. In winters, in names no one records, the legalist state does not ask for volunteers. It requisitions bodies, convicts, conscripts, prisoners of war, men who cut their hair wrong for a tax inspector, all become motion joined to mallet. Some die of exposure and are buried where they fall. Some survive by learning how to sleep in wind that rasps like sand in a bowl. Mothers add a thread of red to a son's sleeve, so that if he comes home, he can be recognized faster than grief. The empire feeds this labor machine along arteries of millet and salt. Garrison towns sprout like knuckles along the line. Storehouses, corrals, kiln smok, a temple that is mostly a promise to return. Yet the wall is never just a barricade. The emperor insists it must also be a broadcast. Towers rise at measured intervals, square-shouldered, windowed to north and south. By day they speak in smoke. By night they speak in flame. The fuel is chosen for visibility dry brush for quick light, oiled reeds for steadiness, wolf dung cakes for a toll, black plume that won't vanish in wind. The codes are simple, because they must be: 1 column for scouts sighted beyond the line, 2 for a raiding party, 3 for an active attack, 5 beacons flaring in a chain for a major incursion. Drums and gongs carry the message down into the valleys. Signal flags and mirror flashes add extra verbs on a clear noon. In good weather, a warning can leap hundreds of li from beacon to beacon before a horse would have found its second hill. And a frontier captain can have men saddled, while the nearest farm still thinks the dust it sees is only dust. Slower in fog, lost in snow, garbled by panic, but still, for the first time, a scattered edge learns to answer as one body. Follow the system south and you find more than fire. Each tower watches not only the plain but its neighbours. Each stockade keeps fresh horses and a slate of distances. 2 towers east to the next well, 4 to the winter pasture that raiders favour, 7 to the depot with extra bowstrings. Runners are timed, not trusted. A scribe knows that the last alarm made it from the western bend to the river, crossing in a fraction of a day. Anything slower means someone somewhere slept or lied. The effect is less a wall than a nervous system. Sensation at the fingertip, reflex in the spine. What is it for? Not to halt an army. No wall halts an army forever. But to steal the one thing the steppe has always owned: surprise. A rider who could be inside a granary by dawn must now dismount to find a gate. A band that once spilled between villages in an hour must now ride along the ridge to a guarded gap, where men who do not panic have been told to expect them. The wall slows. The wall channels. The wall makes raiding less cheap. And sometimes that is victory enough. There is the other purpose. 2. The one a map can't show. Stand atop a Qin rampart and face north. Beyond the ditch, the land runs until it blurs. Mostly empty of buildings that look like yours. Mostly empty of writing that curls like yours. The emperor's line says what his laws say. Here and not here. Inside are roads calibrated to the same axle width. Measure sticks that agree. Coins that rhyme with one another. Outside is what the court calls disorder. Horsemen who travel with homes rolled into felt. Chiefs who change names when it suits them. Bargains sealed with mare's milk. To call the wall a frontier is accurate. To call it a declaration is truer. It teaches farmers to think of empire as a shape. Patrol the wall for a night. You learn to read it like weather. A plume at the far tower wavers false alarm, perhaps a herd's dust. Then a second column lifts, steadier. A third, abrupt. The corporal says nothing. He only points with his chin, and men lift spear and bow. The rhythm of readiness, which is not the rhythm of battle. A courier takes the interior track at a trot and vanishes downhill, the paper under his sash already damp, with the sweat that will carry it to the next gate, 2 towers on. If the signals go to 5, the beacon captain breaks the oil seal on his chest of reserves, the one that smells of rank fat and varnish, and nobody thinks of sleep. Inside the empire, officials learn to use the wall's eyes for more than war. Beacons flash. When smugglers move, flocks through a ravine to avoid tax. Gates become tolls as well as locks. An inspector counts carts, tallies, salt, weighs wool that should be stamped and isn't. The frontier is revenue, and the wall, by forcing motion through measured places, turns commerce into arithmetic. A treasurer can trust. Of course, a line invites testing, and the Jiangnü are mathematicians of pressure. They ride beyond its ends, or bargain at a gate while a second party tries another, or turn south well before the obvious pass, trusting fog and arrogance. The wall answers, as designed, sometimes too late, sometimes perfectly, always at a cost. A beacon chain is only as honest as its tiredest man. A garrison is only as quick as its laziest captain. But even in failure, the system teaches the center what the edge looks like, and an empire that knows its edges is, for a while, harder to unmake. Look again at the construction itself. Rammed earth is not romance, but it is genius of circumstance. Materials underfoot. Technology simple enough to teach by shouting, results that harden into geology. In the arid northwest, a chin wall can last as strata. You can cut it and see the years like tree rings, each layer a season of labor. In wetter country it slumps and must be faced with stone. Later dynasties will do it in brick with crenels like teeth, but under the teeth is still the old jaw, compacted dust that remembers mallets. Admire or condemn the cost, the wall does not care. It outlives the dynasty that ordered it. Qin falls in a breath, Han breathes it back. Others will scavenge its line like a ruined road, but the idea survives, which is often what power is after. A standard of defense and a standard of belonging, a living thing that both watches and is watched. And in the small hours, when even legalists shiver, that watching flows both ways. A sentry leans on cold parapet, hears a horse on hard ground, somewhere beyond the black, and thinks of the day he was taken from his village, of the mother with the red thread. He rubs his hands, counts the towers to east and west, and feels it. Inside the wall is empire. Inside the line is a world that now includes him. He is part of the broadcast he tends, a syllable in a sentence that stretches from river to desert. He listens for the drum. He hopes he hears it in time. Open the ledger. The emperor's never kept. Not tax rolls, not muster lists cost. It begins with a draft notice and ends with a cairn of stones. No one bothers to mark. Under Qin, the call is not polite. Corvée is a sentence, not a duty. Punishment wears the same face as obedience. A man who miscounts grain for an inspector stands beside a prisoner of war and a farmer too slow to pay the salt tax. Chains flatten the distinction. Overseers shout the pace. Mallets answer. Winter is not an argument. Rammed earth drinks, sweat like water, and still asks for more. When a labourer collapses, the wall does not pause to mourn. The legalist state measures only outputs, layers tamped, towers raised, a frontier dragged into a line by hands that will never trace its map. Behind the numbers is a simpler arithmetic fear. The Jiangnü ride where fences mean nothing, their speed, a weapon, their raiding seasons, a second calendar. An empire of fields and books answers with something fields and books can understand. Fixed posts, predictably routes, fire codes that turn panic into procedure. Qin falls and the fear remains. The Han inherit both the wall and the hoofbeats, and for a century they try every verb. Chinese politics knows. They marry princesses to step-lords and call it peace, the Heqin treaties. They open the Hexi corridor with forts at Yumen and Yangguan to feed garrisons and, incidentally, caravans headed for far deserts with silk in their panniers. They repair the line where rain has turned earth to slump, add new watch stations where absence made the beacons stutter, and learn painfully that a wall asks for upkeep the way a horse asks for feed. Then the dynasty learns a second truth. Fixed lines do not erase nomads, and treaties do not erase hunger. Wars recur like seasons. Between Han and Ming there are centuries of forgetting and remembering. Some courts trust mobility more than masonry, turning frontier defense into alliances and patrols. Others face different enemies and different weather, and the wall sleeps. It is raided for stone to build farmhouses, for timber to heat a kiln. A tower becomes a granary, then a ruin, then a picturesque note in a poet's tired brush. But in the 15th century, the fear returns with a different name and better tactics. The Ming overthrow Mongol rule, and then discover that the steppe does not dissolve just because their banners now hang in the capital. After the Tumu crisis of 1449, when a Ming emperor is captured in the open field, brick and mortar become policy. The court shifts from swagger to latticework, and the long wall is rebuilt like a sentence made emphatic. This is the wall tourists know, brick-faced, crenellated, a spine you can stand upon. Passes with teeth, Juyongguan, Shenhaiguan, Jiayuguan become architecture that argues. Batteries for cannon sit behind battlements. Stairways are cut to favor the defender's stride. Beacon stations rise with vaulted fire rooms and storehouses for fuel pre-counted in winter. Qi Jiguang drills troops and writes manuals. Masons mix lime mortar, sometimes enriched with organic binders, into a paste that turns stone to bone. The line is no longer a single thread, but a system of parallels and spurs, walls that protect walls. A geography edited to slow hooves and angle arrows. It is grand, yes, but also granular. Tens of thousands of small, stubborn decisions about where to put a gate and how high to build a parapet in wind that scours skin. Still, the ledger of cost is never closed. Garrison life along the Ming Wall is hunger set to routine. Pay comes late, if at all. Soldiers farm plots between patrols. A commander with too much pride and too little grain learns how quickly loyalty turns to barter. Far from court, the wall governs as much as it guards. It counts carts. Duxus salt requires papers at gates. A barrier becomes bureaucracy. What began as an answer to arrows becomes an engine for receipts. Yet the wall's most enduring account is not one the archives can tally. It is told as a winter story by a woman whose name is both one and many Meng Jiang. In the tale, her husband is taken to the works almost before the wedding. Flowers brown, she walks farther than any envoy, her feet learning the patience of distances, bearing a cloak she sewed for him against the cold. At the camp, she finds no man, only a foreman with a ledger more perfect than his heart. Her husband, he says, is entombed in the wall he helped raise. She does what all the legalist codes cannot imagine. She weeps and refuses to stop. The ground softens under grief. A section of the wall collapses, and the dead reappear for burial with names. In some versions, the first emperor hears of her and offers compensation of a kind that wounds wealth or marriage to himself. She sets impossible conditions, fulfills them, and then chooses the Bohai Sea over empire's pity. In others, she vanishes into the earth, as if grief had found her a gate. None of the gates allow. No historian confuses legend for minutes of a meeting. But nations live on more than documents. Meng Jiang turns masonry into mourning. She is the thesis the annals omit. The tale makes structural the thing every conscript's mother knew, that a wall big enough to draw a line across a continent cannot help being built out of people. It also makes an emperor answerable to a peasant, a reversal no edict could sanction by giving her tears the strength to undo his work. The folk temples raised to her along the frontier, the songs sung in her voice, are not about engineering. They are protest in lullaby form. After Ming, the wall changes work again. The Qing rule from the north, and need it less as a barricade than as a road. Parts are ignored. Others patrolled for tax. Century layer, unlike dust. Farmers borrow bricks when a pigsty needs finishing. A village quarries a buttress to build a school. Then the 19th and 20th centuries bring new kinds of empire, with steam, rifles, ideas. The wall watches, trains, thread valleys it used to command. In 1987, UNESCO blesses it as heritage. The state restores sections and learns, as all hosts do, that pride requires maintenance. Near Beijing, the wall becomes a stair-step of selfies. Soldiers folded into pageants at sunrise. Couples in rented red, walking a ridge that was once a line of dread. Far to the west, the earthwork lies quiet under snow. Fox tracks, writing brighter, truer sentences across it than any human foot. Ask what the wall is, and it will answer with contradictions, because that is what monuments do. It defends and it oppresses. It unifies and excludes. It is an engine of bureaucracy and a theatre of glory. It is a scar, raised tissue that says where you were hurt and where you healed badly. It is a spine, a column that let a young empire stand straighter than its bones alone allowed. It took away lives by command and, in the centuries since, has given meaning by memory to a nation telling itself a story of endurance, to a traveller running a hand along bricks set by men who never saw a camera, to a child hearing of a woman whose grief was stronger than an emperor's will. We are tempted to ask which version is true, the rampart or the ruin, the pride or the wound. The answer is not a choice, but a chorus. The Great Wall is the sum of its uses and abuses, the sum of those who built it and those who broke it, the sum of decrees and folk songs and mortar dust. It is not visible from the moon. It is visible from the present, which is what matters. And when you stand on a tower in a cold wind and watch dawn comb the ridges, you can feel the oldest thing it still does. It draws a line not to end a world, but to explain one. Here, and not here. We, and not we. What we protect, and what our protection costs. A monument like that is not a lesson. It is a question you keep returning to. Are you safer for your walls? Or smaller? What have you purchased with the labor you demanded, the fear you organized, the pride you burnished? The answers change with the century. But the question remains. Stone remembers little. People remember less. Lines. Though lines last, the Great Wall began as a response to hooves in the dark and became a sentence a continent wrote to itself. It is still being revised, every season, by wind, by budget, by story, scar and spine. Both true, both necessary. The cost was terrible. The memory is complicated. The line remains.